he says.
And we're now live.
We're now live. All right. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to the first meeting of the Broadband Task Force. And this is June 8th. And Brian, would you call the roll?
Senator Dockstetter.
Here.
Senator Landon.
Here.
Senator Von Flater.
Here.
Speaker Harshman.
Yes, here.
Representative Lindholm.
Here.
Representative Summers.
Here.
Member Hardesty.
Excused.
Member Schoenfeld.
Here.
Member Sessions.
Here.
Quorum is present.
All right. Thank you, everyone. The first order of business is election of task force chairman, Speaker Harshman.
Okay, thank you, Representative Summers. Members, as you know, this task force was appointed or created by Management Council earlier this spring in response to the CARES legislation and the seemingly guidance that the use for telehealth, telemedicine, teleeducation, and safety uses of CARES funding for broadband enhancement. And so, as you know, the 3 senators, 3 reps, and 3 members of the executive branch. So we generally members elect a chairman only then for these task forces, and these are always generally elected by the members of the task force. And we will not be able to sponsor legislation, but we'll hand that off to another committee. But anyway, so that's a little background for the public and for all of us. But at this time, members, I'd like to nominate Representative Summers to be our chairman.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded that I become chairman of the task force. Are there any other nominations? Are there any other nominations?
Question.
Question being called. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Raise your hand. Raise your right hand close to your face. It is a majority. So thank you. And so I'll take over officially as chairman, and I appreciate the effort. And so first of all, I want people to recognize that we also have Senator Wasserberger. He'll be joining, and Representative Yin, and they are going to be non-voting legislative members of this task force to bring expertise in one in the area of education and the other in the area of actually being an active participant in the internet through a business, consistently a business. And so they are going to be advisors, and they are going to be able to ask questions and provide comment. They just won't be able to vote on anything. And I thought the first thing that would be really appropriate is we legislators, House members and senators, we kind of all know each other, but we don't necessarily know the governor's appointees. And I thought it would be a good time to maybe get a little introduction from these members and of who they are and where they come from, and perhaps why they're here and what their interest is in broadband. And so Ms. Sessions, maybe I would start with you, and then I'll follow that up with the next person.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Barbara Sessions. I live in Afton, Wyoming. I am the Chief Operating Officer for Silver Star Communications. I've been in the industry for about 18 years, familiar with fiber, copper, cable, fixed wireless, and cellular technologies.
Thank you. And if I call you Barbara, forgive me, but I've known you for quite a while because we've been working on this issue for some time.
Yeah.
And if my signal gets wobbly, it just said it was, I apologize. And so the next one I'm going to call on is Lauren Schoenfeld, who I've also known for a while in this bailiwick. So Lauren, please go ahead.
Yes, as
Albert said, I am Representative Somerset. I'm Lauren Shingfeld. I currently live in Rock Springs. I actually grew up in Farson. And I am the chairperson of the State Broadband Council. I came in to be a part of the Broadband Council at its inception. And so we've spent a lot of time, Barbara Sessions is also on that with me. And I came on to the council as a member through my community work. I ran the YWCA of Sweetwater County. I worked with many underprivileged individuals on top of being very familiar with the needs of telehealth throughout our communities, especially growing up and being from Farson, my family, and a lot of experience in working with underprivileged individuals as domestic violence victims, sexual assault victims, and how lack of connection affects them disproportionately. So I'm also a Sweetwater County Commissioner. I was appointed about 1 year ago into that role. So I'm representing that as well.
Thank you, Lauren. And now I will turn to the last member, which is Canyon Hardesty. And I don't know much about you, Ms. Hardesty, so please tell us a little bit about who you are.
Well, thank you, Representative Summers and others. I'm Canyon Hardesty. I work at the University of Wyoming at the Wyoming Institute for Disabilities, which actually works directly with the Wyoming Telehealth Network. So that's my connection with broadband, in addition to our College of Health Sciences does a lot in virtual education. We use the extension of community healthcare outcomes. So we are deeply embedded in community education and training for a wide variety of audiences, from family members to professionals. So we really rely a lot on that infrastructure to deliver best practices, as we should be doing from the university and from the Wyoming Institute for Disabilities that I work with. My background, Representative Summers, is in public health, population health, and healthcare ethics. So I come at that, in addition to my work in the telehealth network and virtual education, really from that systems, populations, education and advocacy perspective, especially around public health. So I'm really honored to be part of this work. So thank you for the appointment or the invitation.
Thank you. And I want to thank all of the governor's appointees for donating your time and your efforts to this effort, as well as many other efforts that you're involved in, I'm sure. And I got a little statement here I want to say, and then we'll dig right in. The Broadband Task Force was created by Management Council of the Legislature. The COVID-19 pandemic resulted in people isolating themselves from one another, which has led to an increased reliance on the internet. The closure of schools, colleges, university, hospitals, and businesses has forced more of these essential functions of society online, thus increasing the need for reliable, affordable, and fast broadband. Wyoming must aggressively meet the challenges of improving broadband in the state if we hope to stay competitive and vibrant in the future. This pandemic has accelerated the movement online by all sectors of society. The task force was created to move the needle with respect to getting better broadband to the public in the near term, to address the need to isolate populations from the disease, and in the long term, to help establish the state as a leader, not a bottom dweller. As of March 2020, Broadband Now rates Wyoming as one of the worst 10 states in the nation for broadband, based upon speed and pricing. And I just want to qualify that by saying we still don't know, because of good mapping, where we're really at in this state. And I do really want to thank all the telecoms out there for all of their hard work to get our kids online during this time. They made an amazing effort, including Ms. Sessions made the offer to hop clear over here to Sublette County to try to get our kids online, and Union eventually got us some hotspots and did a wonderful job. And I want to shout out to Union as well for helping me get online more than I am. So I don't want to suggest that telecom has done nothing in Wyoming, quite to the contrary. I just think the challenges with providing broadband in a very rural Wyoming it's just very difficult to make a business case in some cases. And so there's a large reliance on federal dollars and other dollars to really reach that last mile that is a very remote last mile in Wyoming. And so we want to aid that effort. And to that, we're going to go to an overview of broadband in Wyoming. And a few years ago, the legislature, actually the Management Council, it was a bill, created during the whole Endow times, created the Broadband Council and created a grant program. And so the first one I'm going to turn it over to today to talk about the Broadband Advisory Council is our own member, Ms. Schoenfeld. So Ms. Schoenfeld, maybe you could take us through your presentation.
Absolutely. Many of you were involved in the legislation that created the Broadband Council, and so I'm not going to go too much into depth in the actual bill, but that legislation, it was the original SF 100. It put into place the Broadband Council, the broadband program, the funding around it, and the state broadband manager position. That legislation also put into place a timeline for the Broadband Council. We began meeting in July of 2018, and we had the deadline of September 1st to create the state broadband plan and how to move forward. That plan was presented and approved by the Wyoming Business Council with really a lot of focus around 4 different areas, of which we had subcommittees and still have subcommittees moving forward as well. And so leveraging public-private partnerships, mapping and updating mapping, and then removing barriers to deployment and increasing access to funding and emerging technologies were the areas that we really were focused on moving forward after that broadband plan was created. The Broadband Council consists of 11 individuals and then is led by the broadband manager that reports to the Business Council. Ryan Cadera is our broadband manager currently, and we had one prior to him, Russ Elliott, of which some of you may know and have maybe have worked with. So some of the things that we are focused on currently are the public-private partnerships, removing barriers to deployment, increasing access to funding, and then Ryan is also working on some mapping, updating, and he's on the agenda. He's going to talk a little bit about that initiative. As Representative Summers brought up, we do not have a really good idea of where we need to expand. I think a lot of our providers know where they have opportunities to expand, but in total, that's something that we absolutely need to move forward successfully. And like I said, Ryan is working on that currently. We, through this COVID crisis, we've really seen where we have connection issues and where we don't have connection issues. I also believe that our broadband providers throughout the state have really done an excellent job of stepping up and providing assistance where needed, especially to get our kids connected through education. But we do have a ways to go to keep that connection going and to make it stable and reliable. So with that, I will turn it over to everyone to answer any ask any questions around what the Broadband Council has been doing. We did have a gap in time that we actually felt like we made progress. Russ Elliott left fall of last year, and we just recently, the beginning of this year, Ryan was hired. And so he's spent the last few months really getting up on his feet and getting across the state to learn, who's who with the broadband working. He's obviously familiar with the technology and the IT around that. He worked for a provider for a lot of years before coming to the Business Council, and we're excited to have him. So I'll take any questions and then turn it over to Ryan to explain what he's working on currently.
Ms. Schoenfeld, thank you. Thank you for that presentation. So everybody on the committee, on the task force, if you want to ask a question, just put your hand right up there in front of your face and wave it a little bit and I'll see you. Or if you raise your little blue hand that's in your participants note, if I don't see it, one of my staff will see that and let me know. The hand wave is the best because it's a pretty small group and I can see you. So does anybody have any questions of Lauren? Representative Lindholm, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it and appreciate the the context given by Ms. Schoenfeld in regards to the Broadband Advisory Council and your efforts there. How close are we to accomplishing some of the original charter of the Broadband Advisory Council? I know that there was a kind of a weird deal that shook out when we lost our executive director and then had to hire in new, and so there's that little bit of an issue. But what timeline are we looking at as far as some of those original charter ideas?
So a lot of the original charter ideas are well
Ms.
on the way.
Laurenfield, remember we always go through the chair. Sorry. So.
Oh,
Ms.
sorry, Mr.
Laurenfield,
Chair.
Go ahead.
A lot of the charter ideas and original ideas around the Broadband Council are well on the way. We are in the process of getting some funding out the door. There was an issue, Representative Lindholm, on getting the forms and the process through the Business Council on the grant applications. And Ryan has been working on that since he started. That has been one of his main tasks. And he also will be able to give a time frame. We're thinking in the next couple of months that we'll be able to have money out the door. We have 2 pending grant applications currently that are well on their way to moving forward.
Ms. Sessions, I thought I saw your hand raised as well. Nope. Okay. Are there any other? Representative Lindholm, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate that response. And that's really great news that application is going to be done here shortly. The last I had heard from one of my counties that I represent, they had gone to your organization and said, hey, we're interested in applying. And there was never any application that was created from the get-go under the prior director. So that obviously was an issue. So the way I understand it is that application is going to be done in the next couple of months. How do we already have 2 applicants then? Were they allowed to skip that application process? How do I get my county to be able to skip that application process?
Ms. Schoenfeld.
Mr. Chairman, the 2 applications that are pending currently, they did apply. There was a process. It wasn't thoroughly vetted. And so there were issues with that process. I do believe, and we'll have to talk to Ryan about this, but I do believe he's also working on 2 or 3 other grant applications. So he may be working with your county. If not, let's get him in touch and get those applications in and moving so we can get them funded.
Representative Lindholm seems to be satisfied for now. I'll turn this next over to Ryan Cadera. And Ryan, maybe you could walk us through whatever you would like to walk us through, and I believe it would be appropriate to touch on that application process. As I recall, being a liaison on that task, on that council, that there was an application process that was created and there were applicants made and the people were looking, there were projects being sought, right? And then I think there was some issues that were identified in the original application process that had to be corrected. And so I think in the meantime, people are still looking for projects out there, even though we may not have a full application process. So Ryan, if you would go ahead, please do so.
All right. Thank you, Chairman Summers. Basically, we're just kind of getting back to speak directly about the grant program and all that. Yeah. when I came on, I actually part of the interview process as I identified some of the issues up front. There was a form that was needed to be supplied by the business council that was not processed. So that's why we went in and pulled. Actually, I came in, that was the first thing I did, was pretty much put that on the shelf for now until we can get it where it needs to be enacted and move forward very quickly. As far as the application that I mentioned and that Representative Lindholm mentioned has been written. It was put out for review, and then it's going back to the advisory council for additional review and then eventual publication. As far as the two applicants that are concerned, they will not be they'll be held to the same standard. They'll have an opportunity to write their applications as to the process. That will be again up to them. And indirect response, yes, I have been in contact actually since the first week with one of Representative Lindholm's areas, one of his counties he represents, and we've been in conversation throughout regarding this process. In fact, they've received a draft copy just kind of as an idea of what we're looking for moving forward, to where that helps and aids in their process, so that when we do let the program and get it moving forward again, they're as prepared as they can be. So moving on and trying to address the broadband situation in Wyoming, just a little bit of background for me. I moved here to be a central office technician in Bags, where I currently reside. And fortunately, through the efforts of the local provider and the agreement on the business council, because of the necessity to be able to be mobile and the access I have here, I actually work remotely full time. Outside of COVID, I work from Bags. So I have, good connectivity here, and just another proof of what can be done with the proper connection. So just wanted to throw that in there as well. Priority number one has been the grant program, getting it put through, as well as identifying and leveraging the public-private partnerships that are necessary to move the broadband initiative forward in the state of Wyoming. Second to that, by no means less, would be to remove barriers for deployment. There are barriers that we have across the state that can be addressed different ways. It's just a matter of helping everyone understand what needs to be done, what can be done, and how we work around that. So that's an ongoing process as well. We're always looking for access to funding, trying to figure out any way to fund progress in our state. One point I'd like to make that was made at the Joint Education Committee is Wyoming, while we keep using the rural mentality of broadband especially, but it also applies even to an EMT world. Where I came from years ago, Frontier is more the name. There's a lot of rural parts of Virginia that is actually handled much differently than what we need to reach our areas and actually provide successful broadband. So as we think about moving that forward, needing to think a little further than just rural, because we are. And then finally, one large point is education for basically everyone, trying to get a little further understanding of broadband, what it looks like, what it does, what we can do, what we can't do, just even the basics. If you have trouble at home, why can't you connect? Just some basic ideas for folks, and also what different things mean, because this is a whole new world for a lot of folks, and trying to get them the information that they need to be successful in this new world is also important. So that brings us on to standards. Do have a plan I provided at the LSO. I'll let you guys review that so we can summarize this the best we can. Service standards, to start with that, speeds are the topic. 25, 300 meg, however you want to look at it, speeds are the topic. The next topic is symmetrical versus asymmetrical. Honestly, none of that matters if you don't have a connection. So we have the gamut. I have gig available at my house if I want it. I know folks don't even have that available in the state. So we have the full breadth to deal with when it moves forward. On top of that is reliability, redundancy, and then of course latency. Latency is a huge thing that's never brought up, but latency affects meetings such as these that require live interaction. And to me, that is imperative for the success of our broadband. FCC has addressed that in their latest RDOF release, which is a funding that's coming out later this year that's $20.4 billion for the country. So while latency hasn't been part of the conversation before, it's slowly gaining traction. So between these four things, speeds, reliability, redundancy, and latency, addressing those four items together will help set the standards for the pace of Wyoming and place us as a leader in connectivity. Second to that would be funding. We're always looking for funding. We've identified several different sources. All of them at this point are federal, economic development, public works, of course, the age-old FCC and USDA, but we have also identified for a couple of responses, Department of Defense and Homeland Security. We're working on those with Wyoming Homeland and Camp Guernsey pretty much as we speak. Just a number, everybody was looking for a number a few weeks ago. Well, unfortunately, I have that number. It's low for what actually will be needed, but $1.2 billion is the estimate that we need to deploy 25/3 service to about 90% of the state. It's a heavy lift. It's a lot of money. Some of it will become available in federal money as we move forward. Some of it's available in the state grant program, but that was actually given to me by an analyst group out of Minneapolis. So they answered the call and gave us the number. So that's what I've been working off of. The other point is local government participation. You know, we hear a lot from county. Yes, sir.
Ryan, just a quick note for you, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but on that 1.22 billion or 25 billion number, perhaps later you could provide us with that analysis, this task force, where that came from, kind of what that's about, what they looked at, so we have a little better understanding of that. And then one other question that I've formulated here as you go forward, and I don't know now because I haven't kept up as well. Many of the old federal programs, you couldn't get the money as a provider unless, you know, this area you were trying to provide in had less than 10-1 or 25-3. You know, what are the conditions now on the federal dollars? And do you have, and I know Barbara will know this as well because they hunt these dollars, but you know, what are the new conditions set for? So do we have hope that there'll be less strings attached to some of that federal dollars, which will actually allow better deployment? So if you can, at some point, speak to a little more detail of the federal dollars as well. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you, Chairman Summers. I'll just, I do have that information and I'd be on here through the duration and I can share that at any time. I'll try and find it now as well. In regards to the federal dollars, yeah, you are correct. The FCC with the RDOF program is, while some things address additional access to funding, there are several limitations, including the clause where if there was an area that was awarded any other monies under a grant program, even on the state level, they will be disqualified from the potential RDOF funding, as well as a large section of Wyoming that received USDA funding for a satellite based response, that because of that award are now also disqualified from the RDOF program. So while there is monies available at the federal level, there are continuing barriers to access to that, depending upon if awards have been made in a particular area, and notwithstanding whether those deployments were successful or not. So I hope that, Mr. Chairman, I hope that answers a little better. Okay. Just moving through, and again, you have a copy of this presentation was provided to LSO. I imagine they'll put it on, but just to address your concerns, just run through it. The local government participation, again, I've been in contact with several different counties and cities across the state of varying degrees. So I think more participation from even the larger cities and even the unincorporated parts of Wyoming, and then building those relationships with the counties to where when I am contacted by an unincorporated portion, we can move on it. And I have to give a big shout out to all the regional directors in the state. They have, not only during the COVID response, they have gone above and beyond there, but during the whole time, any whisper of broadband, they sent it directly to me and were the liaison to the rest of the state as well. So big hats off to them, and look forward to their continued participation in broadband as we continue to try to move the needle forward. But again, local government cooperation and thinking outside of the box at the local level will be imperative to move the needle as well. Another point I'd like to make that's come up across the board.
One more little interruption, Ryan. Sorry, just for the entire committee's knowledge. The grant program that we established, in case people have forgotten, legislators as well. Our grant program kind of requires a nexus to local government. So it requires a public-private partnership. And so really the public piece of it has to instigate the grant and then ask for a public or a private partner. And that can be a bit of a struggle as well. So I just wanted everybody to know, as you talked about reaching out to local government, part of the reason to do that is, one, to knowledge of where we have issues, but it's also a bit of a mandate in the current grant program that we have.
Yes, and thank you, Chairman Summers. That brings up another point along this new RFP. Is the RFP, and I've said publicly before, and I'll say that again, the guidance, it's a guidance document for the public entity, whoever is applying for the grant program, to take that guidance document and help coin their RFP for whatever they're trying to reach. It's just an outline to try and bring the information they need to make a successful deployment. As the one thing about all this, and especially with the exposure broadband is getting, we all want to fix it, we all want to move the needle, but unfortunately it's like building other things. If we don't have a solid, firm foundation and a decent plan moving forward, we can build a house that'll stand 10 years versus one that stands 100 or 2. So really want to make sure that we're doing this correctly and making sure the longevity is available as well. I'll apologize while I try to look for things as we move along. The other point that I'd like to make, and moving forward, that really hasn't been addressed yet, it's something I'm going to try and bring forward as well, that really, I think the FCC, and to speak to the providers and the wonderful work they did with our students, both K-12 and college students, is digital inclusion. I think it's easily identified as far as on the education piece, where there were people, including I've heard, as well as teachers, that may not have adopted broadband at home and been reliant upon connections elsewhere to serve their broadband needs. But with the change and with the impacts of COVID, we've been able to, districts have been able to identify areas and students that didn't have service, and then the providers stepped up to fix and provide wherever they could. So that brings to light a whole different facet of broadband. And with that, I'd say digital inclusion is what the phrase is. It was coined back in Maine and is prevalent across eastern parts of the country. And what that is just ensuring connections for those less fortunate. Not only the broadband connections, but devices, anything they need to where they can be included in the digital age and help build themselves and their education moving forward. So while Wyoming currently doesn't have any plan in place for that, it is something that maybe should be included moving forward to try and help those less fortunate and see what we can do to help their world as well. So moving on, so I've been here officially, I think since the 12th of January, and I've been locked in my house since the 12th of March. So we had basically 60 days to get out and travel. Fortunately, I put several thousand miles on in 60 days, which was lovely. But since then, I just quit reporting mileage because it doesn't move. In fact, we had to mow the grass from around the car. Anyway, success stories since January. Broadband providers will be providing their mapping data to help identify areas of Wyoming that could be lacking broadband. I'll speak to this more here in a minute, and we'll try and share my screen to get you to provide more information and background on that as well. And then final development of procedures needed for the broadband grant program applications. And we spoke to that a bit before. The other part that was not seen, that was missing, was a scoring document to be able to fairly scrutinize applicants coming in on the backside at the Business Council. So that is also up for consideration within the next couple of weeks. We'll move that forward, and as soon as we have that approved, of course, it'll be published and distributed. Collaborative efforts since January have been just amazing. Honestly, I have been in Wyoming Telecom for almost 20 years now, and while on one side it may seem that Wyoming Telecom wants to fight because they're competitors and all this, but the reality is one cannot live without the other. There is no one provider that can stand alone, separate. It's a team. They know it, we know it, and we just need to address it that way. And it's been great. So I just want to throw that out there as well. We've had great conversations with everyone, and look forward to moving that forward as well. The current collaborative efforts have been through ETS, Department of Education, Department of Health, Canyons, Wyoming Telehealth Network, federally, the NTIA. We're actually working with the NTIA. They support the State Broadband Leaders Network, which I'm very active in, receive a lot of information across the country of what's going on as far as broadband is concerned, and what's going on at the federal level as well that may affect Wyoming positive or negatively, and able to address that as we move forward. We do have conversations with the NTIA. We will be moving on to include our mapping program within the federal National Broadband Access Mapping System here shortly, as soon as the contracts are approved. We'll be state number 18, I believe, moving into that process for them to help move the needle on the mapping situation as well. Been working with FCC. Fortunately, FCC Chairman Pai was in the state to visit this year since I was here. And again, shout out to our friends in Wind River for allowing us the information and the contacts to bring him to the governor's office as well. So that was a good boon for our state. The USDA, I work close with the USDA. Mr. Roop, of course, came from Wyoming, and he's very, very active. We talk quite a bit on what we can do and how to move things forward as well. As I mentioned, the State Broadband Leaders Network, the Digital Inclusion Network, and we also work with the Wyoming Telecom Association, Wyoming Business Alliance. One unknown thing, I really don't publicize this, but I'm also helping Western Wyoming Community College and LCCC on developing a program for broadband technicians. Now, I taught for over a year, almost 2 years at a technical college on a telecom technician role. and was able to bring that knowledge back to the state of Wyoming. And we're helping them deploy a broadband provider framework for an education certificate to start and then develop it further. And just to let this task force know, not only currently the only participants in that are providers within the state. There's nobody participating from out of state. However, my contacts from years past, I have gotten a lot of interest from providers outside of the state, large providers, cell phone providers, et cetera, that would be looking for such a program as well. So while that just helps the conversation to move the needle here in Wyoming. And then finally, the University of Wyoming. We work at length with University of Wyoming on several facets. Right now, the largest with the geospatial group and the mapping program, but we're also working with other departments as well, trying to figure out moving forward, case studies, et cetera, as we move ahead. Current counties we're working on of interest to Mr. Lindholm is Crook County, Albany County. We're looking at Niobrara, Goshen, and Platte County. I mentioned Camp Guernsey. Portions of unincorporated Natrona County. Recently been added to Lincoln County, have responses to Park County as well as Bighorn County. So there's, and that's not all inclusive. There's a lot that come in, we speak for a little bit and leave, and kind of, again, leave it to the local governments and the local folks looking for information, give them the information they need to move forward a little bit, and then look for them to return and see what we can do additionally. And basically past there, providing information to our congressional delegation, Governor Gorder's office, legislators such as yourself, and county, city and county government. Excuse me a second. So,
Ryan,
yes, sir.
are you moving to a different place, or should I cut in and ask you some questions and get some questions, or where are you at in your presentation?
I've got one more response regarding the broadband initiative, and then also I'll quickly cover recent events in the past 72 hours as well, if that's all right with you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, go ahead, please.
All right, thank you. Within the past 72 hours, more collaboration has come in, honestly, with our state librarian as well, as we're looking for quick results relatable to the COVID response. I'm working with him directly, and then of course we'll be working with all the local library groups as to help moving forward community broadband access. ETS also has ideas on how to do that as well. So that's been within the past 72 hours, and honestly within the past, what time is it? 9 o'clock. So within the past 16 hours, we've had a good relationship with the Wyoming Rural Electric Association. He reached out. They've reached out as well for additional conversations as well. So while things seem to be slow, they're continuing to move pretty much all the time. So bring that forward. And finally, if it's all right, I may share my screen, Mr. Chairman.
Ryan, and I'll turn to Brian Fuller because I don't know if there's anything I need to do. So Brian, what do we need to do for him to share his screen?
Mr. Chairman, he should just be able to click on share screen.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Brian. So Ryan, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. See if I can do this one right. Okay, you guys see that okay?
I can see it. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, to speak to one of our collaborative efforts, and honestly, this has probably happened I looked to Lauren and Barbara, probably within the past 2-3 weeks at the very most. We were able to kind of get agreement with Telecom Association, get some ideas moving forward. CenturyLink was also involved. The 2020 Wyoming Broadband Data Initiative Again, we're moving the needle immensely here. This is a collaborative effort to collect statistically meaningful data, and to give proper homage to that, that comes from Teal Wyckoff, our mapping guru for the state. And what that means is we're going to work together with all the providers. From satellite down, everybody that wants to provide information on a voluntary basis is able to do so. Teal has built a process by which they have their own individual login and portal to our mapping system that they can upload their information directly to our map. And while the FCC and I'm sure you guys have heard that have been involved, the 477 map, the 477 map has been required by the FCC for years to try and get an idea of what's out there and what's not. Well, it's more about pretty colors on a page than a statistical map that can be used to collaborate much of anything, honestly. So this is to resolve that. We're not collecting data based on a census block. We're not collecting data on a marginal platform. We're collecting data provided by the providers on what they call a shapefile. And that shapefile is, you can drill down to within feet of where the edge actually is. And it does not require a township range. It does not require a census block. It can be designed anywhere along their group. And they're providing this information voluntarily, and then we're going to publish it on our map. And with the intent, we'll put that information on the front of our map, to where as we have companies and individuals that want to move to Wyoming and move their businesses, come for work, however we can do it to not only move the needle for broadband, but to expand our economic development across the state utilizing our broadband and other means. We'll put those providers front and center to where they can look and see what's available where, and make it easy for them to make decisions moving forward. So with that, we'll move on. This information will also provide the data-driven analytics, providing calculated solutions. Yes, sir.
Ryan, just I think a note for the committee, and probably the frustration, at least for me, and I think some other members of the legislature, is what is it now since we rolled out the bill and passed the legislation on the broadband? It's been at least 2 years, right? We've been 2 years since that legislation's been up and running. One of the primary things in that legislation for this council to do was mapping. And here we're 2 years out and we don't even have the map. And I'm not going to blame the council because, frankly, and I'll just be honest, there was a real reluctance by industry to put out proprietary information on where they are and where they may be going. And so there's been this push-pull on how do you find out what exists in Wyoming. And so there were some, attempts to just look, okay, we'll do a participant survey, what speed test survey. So we did that. But there has been a real reluctance to get at the data you have just suggested that we're finally getting to. So here we're 2 years out and we're just now beginning to get a map. We still don't have an approved application process. And frankly, and I'm going to throw this back on us as legislators. We made such a complicated grant program to try to satisfy everybody's concerns, and both industry and legislative and public concerns, that we created a grant program that is very hard to thread the needle and very hard to create an application process and actually get money out the door. So I just wanted one for you to know. I think you understand all this. You've got caught up to speed. I know certainly Barbara and Lauren understand this. The mapping is a big deal. It's really hard to move forward with other ideas unless you do broad-based proposals, like frankly we're going to see later, without understanding what exists today and where people are going. And so I'm really encouraged to see this. I just think it's 2 years late in coming. But thank you for this. And I just wanted to interject that. And Ryan, I'll turn it back over to you. If anybody has any questions right now, I can't see everybody because of the small screen, but just speak up if anybody wants to ask Ryan a question right now before we move any further. I don't see or hear anything, so you might have to holler for me to see it right now. So Ryan, please go ahead.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The second large point to all of this is the data-driven analytics portion of this. Again, as you mentioned, the mapping is something that is has been a bit of a mystery, and this is our thoughts to try and address that. And not only has Wyoming struggled, the whole state, or the whole country has, excuse me. So this is our latest attempt to try and resolve that. And it's, like I said, it's been a huge push forward with the collaboration from the providers. And to be honest with you, we have gotten data already. We just started, I believe, last week with the login information to the providers. And we have gotten information from 3 so far. And with this, not only have I asked for the public facing data of where their broadband coverage may or may not be, I am also asking for long haul and middle mile fiber connectivity. Now this I have assured all the providers, and they are very, and understandably so, as being from industry, very protective of that information for a lot of different reasons. So with that, it's information that's available to myself, and should we need that information to move forward, then we'll keep that information, that proprietary information, protected to where we can help move the needle is there, but not only protected, but in collaboration with the providers as we see projects coming forward. Is while we want to see, while it's imperative for us to see the whole picture, it's also imperative for us to continue to work with the providers to make the necessary changes to, again, to move the needle moving forward across the state, be it, be it clear out in the edges of Natrona County or Crook County, as well as downtown Cheyenne. So being able to have that visibility, I think will help us move forward as well. But with that, we can take the data that we receive and run analytics on it and look at it. And that's going to give us what we need to sharpen the knife, be able to put the results and put the activity where Wyoming needs it to make the changes. And that is going to be huge. And honestly, is my understanding across the country, this kind of effort, this amount of data, this type of data right now on a state level is unprecedented. So we're blazing a trail here. And I know a lot of folks are watching us, and we're all very excited to get this data. And there's several avenues that if we can perfect this, they're going to be looking to do the same. So we're really excited about that. With that, the broadband mapping analytics, it will be able to go in on all federal grant loan programs. It'll provide information to further those. It'll provide a ton of information to further the Wyoming Broadband Grant Program. We'll also further provider reporting. I'll get to that in just a second. It'll show terrestrial broadband coverage. That's the main goal. To speak to that just a little bit, while this is the first iteration, this is the first version of the map moving forward, and it'll be relatively simple at this time. Because we have the shape files, we will be able to move quickly going forward and be able to build what I'm calling, the concentric rings of coverage. Because as we know, anytime you move away from a CO or a remote device or router, etc., your connectivity will dwindle at an estimated pace. Physics are physics, and they can be proven. And it doesn't matter if it's a wired connection or a wireless connection, it fades out over distance. So with the terrestrial broadband coverage and the information they provide, not only can we forecast that, we can prove it. So service availability, again, what's shown is shown, what's covered is covered, what's not is not. So that right there will move the needle to help in the planning and moving forward of the broadband, because it's a public information. Our providers across the state will be able to see the holes and move to fill them. So, and as far as moving to fill them, it's been amazing. Wireline, wireless carrier, or when I say wireless, I'm talking fixed wireless providers across the state. But when there is an identified area of coverage, it's been amazing the efforts that are put in place to try and rectify that once an area has been identified. So while some of the things have been slow to move, it has also affected the responses from our providers across the state. Excuse me. The other point on here, and again, it's more iterations down the road of this, would be outage reporting. Should providers have outage and give us the information, or even, depending on what that looks like at that version level, we could actually provide to where if we have known long-term outages on broadband, be able to supply that information with this kind of mapping. So again, I want to reiterate that broadband availability information is being supplied by the Wyoming broadband providers on a very detailed level. So with that brings the collaborative effort behind this. The largest being the Wyoming Department of Education. We're still working on this, on how we're going to deploy it, but the Wyoming Department of Education has agreed to help push us out there to outside of the actual provider supplied data. We're going to continue with the speed tests and try and understand the coverages we do or don't have on a user level. So with that, the Department of Education is going to help us identify that. So through a process that we're still working through to understand that kids are out of school, might be a little harder to get a hold of. We're still going to push forward and try and get the information on speed tests where it's available, provide a system to where folks that don't have internet or don't have connectivity or can't get on can go to their library or someplace that they can actually respond and say, no, I don't have connection and this is why. So we're really going to look forward to that partnership moving forward to gain the information we need for the speed tests and further identify and place more data in there to allow us to hone in on what needs resolved. And I don't want to leave out by any short term the Geographic Information Science Center. Teal and her team have been amazing, and they're really looking forward. So far, all the crazy ideas I've brought to them as far as how to provide maps, and I've been mapping broadband since 1996, so this is nothing new to me. I've been really amazed at what they can do and how fast they can do it. Honestly, that she was able to take the portal idea and move forward with that within days. So hats off to them. Then
Ryan?
Also, yes, sir.
So Ryan, I got a couple of questions for you. And one is, I guess one would be, so there's two things, right? There's availability of broadband, and then there's really the ability to pay for broadband. And has the council, and I don't believe we have, I haven't been very active about the last year. Has the council looked at pricing? So is Wyoming's pricing for broadband similar to other areas? Do we know how many people frankly can't, you can have all the broadband fiber to the home you want or whatever. If people can't afford it, they're not going to get it. Or they're going to go to the least expensive option, which likely could be the worst option to get what they need. And so I do wonder about availability to different economic levels. And I'm not going to have you expound on that very long because we do have to keep moving. And then the other thing, the question I'd ask you, and I'd ask you to research this, is in the state of Wyoming, we have oil and gas pipelines, and we have we have electric lines, power poles. Do we have that map? Do we as a state of Wyoming, as an entity, the state of Wyoming, do we know where all of that stuff exists? We have that mapped. Can we map that? Do we require that to be mapped? I think frankly, I would assume that because we permit it all, right? We permit power lines, we permit pipelines. We may not map it, but we permit it all. And so there's a variety of entities that, whether it be state or local, that permit everything that broadband people put in. And my question is can we simply as a state require that information? Can we require that data, that mapping effort be done? Because I think other major transportation pieces, whether it be electricity or whether it be petroleum or gas, we know where all of those facilities are because we permit them. So a question is can we just require it to be mapped?
Sorry, I had taken notes here. Okay, I'll make a quick comment on your first question as far as affordability and cost wise. On a very high level, and this is all personal understanding, as far as I'm aware, affordability is relatively consistent. I don't see where there's any large cost advantages or disadvantages within the state of Wyoming. Now, as far as affordability and options for those less fortunate, leads back to my introduction of the term digital inclusion. That portion of it is, or that phrase, I guess, is the study and analysis and actually response to providing, low income or assisted connections moving forward. And just again, to reiterate, the FCC Keeping Americans Connected Act was a voluntary program. All of our providers signed up to it and have been providing free connections to students that needed them. So anything that this group could look at moving forward once that act goes out of play, then would probably help in that digital inclusion piece. And I can get more information as needed as well. Now, as far as mapping on the long haul, that's where so far I have asked for the voluntary information of the mapping of the what they call long haul and middle mile on the fiber, because most in the industry know that our information superhighway is not unlike I-80. Trucks come in on 25, get on 80 and go west, drive through, might buy gas or might buy fuel, may not, and that's all we see of them. The digital information is no different. We have several high capacity long haul routes right within a stone's throw of I-80 that are doing the exact same thing. In fact, I know the links across Wyoming have been used as a test bed for a couple of tier 1 providers for years and continue to be. So the information's there. It's just figuring out how to utilize that and work with those providers and bring them into the fold moving forward as well. But as far as requiring the information, on a very high level, I'm not sure how that would be done, because anything related to IP or internet protocol thus far is unregulated. So to where oil and gas and electricity are all regulated at the PSC, IP transport is not. And so that's where we could get into, and that's why a lot of providers are willing to give that information out voluntarily, but with the agreement of the proprietary information being protected. That's kind of why the agreement on this data initiative is that you give me the middle mile and long haul data that we need to move the needle in Wyoming, we will protect it because, you know, that is your business case. And there honestly is billions that have been invested in this state already over the past 20 years to provide the long haul and the local fiber routes that we enjoy today. So hope that answers your question, Chairman.
Ryan, it does to a degree. Yes, it is an unregulated industry. I suppose that doesn't mean we couldn't require it anyway. I guess that would be us regulating something there. I guess my other question is, and my concern all along, I certainly understand the proprietary nature of information, but it becomes, if you are the only one that knows what's going on, and we only map a piece of it, frankly, it does the state and providers a disservice, because then we don't ever overcome the hump of the Broadband Now ratings. You know, regardless of whether Broadband Now is accurate or not, that we're the 46th state in the nation, 46th worst, you know, state of the nation for broadband, whether that's accurate or not, it is a perception that will be in the public's eye nationally as they move, if they look to move to another state. I think the more that we are able to accurately map and show where and how much and what we do have for broadband, and I know we've talked about this on the council, the better we are to highlight the good things that happen in Wyoming. But if only 2 or 3 companies decide to provide you information, that really doesn't provide a full picture. And so I guess just those are some thoughts I have. And so Ryan, I'm gonna, unless you have something, I wanna kind of keep moving. Unless you have a couple of really quick thoughts, I'm gonna give you, if we are to move the needle, so to speak, these are questions. Give me 2 things that you think we could do. This is off the cuff. 2 things that we could do to really make a difference, because that's what ultimately we're here to try to do.
Two things. Well, I already spoke to this at the Joint Ed. There was an initiative I came from an electrical transmission company to this position, and of which I was a communications person down there as well. And I saw the results of some of the changes in our neighboring state on electrical easements, as you'd mentioned. And because of that, they were able to, an entire county in the western part of the state was able to bring broadband to areas they've never had it. Of probably all the studies and the comparatives out there, that county is relatively comparable to a good section of Wyoming. So because of those changes they made legislatively in Colorado, it moved their needle consistently.
Changes in what? Because I didn't hear that.
Sorry, this was relating to electrical easements.
So Ryan, just to further expand on that, what are you saying? That electrical easements could carry broadband, that rural electrics could then provide broadband? Do we do or not do that in Wyoming? Explicitly, what are you talking about?
Explicitly, I'm talking about the electrical easements that exist today. And most of those were all under a utility format, which, as you know, is regulated and has different ideologies behind it. Where the pole, honestly, right now, the pole lines exist. You know, the discussions of the pole line and all this are for another format. But the pole lines exist, the wires are there, the right-of-ways put into place. And the only thing that we need to move forward as to deploy fiber on those exact same routes is to string fiber on the poles. And right now, the existing agreements do not allow that because it's a utility right-of-way, and broadband is not a utility. So
Ryan, even though that is true, most electric carriers are required to allow at a cost are required to allow, federally are required to allow broadband to carry. Now, I don't know if that's on all electrics, but like the big one here, Rocky Mountain Power, they are required to allow that. They'll ask for payment per pole, and maybe that prices people out of using it. But explain a little bit more there.
Go a little to the right.
And you'll have to forgive me because this is a very high level understanding. I actually came from the transmission world, and just like broadband, electrical is divided into two distinct and not separate, but related entities. You have distribution, which is what you see in your alleys of towns. And what you speak to there is that's regulated by the city, oftentimes under franchise agreements. And you're right, they're required to allow others to access their poles. And then those agreements are how they are between whoever owns the pole and the town, and it gets kind of interesting there as well. And most of those poles are in alleys and streets, which are utility right-of-ways again. So once you leave that distribution portion, again, I have a very high understanding of distribution for sure, a little bit further on transmission lines. But once you move out of town, those big transmission lines that run between towns run across this state. In fact, there's some very large ones, the largest ones built, being strung across the state right now. And they're a utility. Now the utility can go in and they're starting to require to be having what they call smart grid. So these companies, the utilities, are required to provide connectivity to their substations, and some of them are electing to move fiber forward to do that. They can because it's a utility, and monitoring the substations is a utility service. So they're not in violation of any current easements. Now, if they move outside of that and start offering broadband over that same fiber, they have to move their easements to a commercial easement, which as of right now requires a whole new negotiation on the easement per landowner for every landowner they cross. So that's a very time consuming and costly event that is a barrier. A lot of folks don't want to take that expense on. I've talked directly with my old provider, and they have responded the same way. They will do what their members say, but somebody's got to pay the bill to be able to do that.
Thank you, Ryan. I think I'm going to open it up for questions to you. I guess you had two. So what's your second, I guess, before we move on?
Sorry, did I miss something?
Yeah, so Ryan, sorry. So that was your first. And then you had a second. I said, what are two things that can move the needle on broadband? You said one would be electric corridors. I believe that's what I would gather out of that. And two, what would be your second?
The second's a heavier lift, and I'm not sure how to do this, but Wyoming has a range. We have areas that have absolutely no service, or depending upon the locale, a very low probability of ever getting thing besides satellite. I don't want to be that way, but reality, that's the way it is. But then we have my house that I can get gig right here to a mile east of Bags. So that's the playing field. But then we also have issues even in the cities that don't qualify for any federal aid, that don't qualify for any state aid, that are stuck, I guess. And you can actually provide 10 gigabit, to the home if you really want to. Not that we need that right yet, but we might, and we need to plan for that. So the second thing I really hadn't thought of, but figuring out a way to, we're trying to address with the grant program. Your comments of streamlining that would be very beneficial, as far as moving the needle forward on that 10 million that's there. We're trying to work through the process now, and even with even with the new documents and everything else, it's going to take time just to get that moved through, time that honestly we don't have for many reasons. So that, I guess, would be the second ask at this point, with reservations of additional information as it becomes available.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator Landon, please go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ryan, I really appreciate that. That's a lot of information for somebody like me who's riding a little slower horse on this front, but I thank you for all of that. And I also thank you for the conversation we had last week on joint education. And frankly, I'm very intrigued by this legislation that you shared with us from the state to the south of us and what it was able to do in terms of access. Before I go forward with any legislation, I always want to know who's going to throw rocks at the windshields on this front. If we were to pursue moving forward with that legislation, and I think we should consider that, Mr. Chairman. My question, Ryan, to you is, who doesn't like that and why?
Ryan, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman. Yeah, Senator Landon, it's a rocky boat whenever you talk about easements and access. I think the largest thing to speak directly to is a revenue stream. Case in point is there was a patented right-of-way on a 10-year agreement between Grand Junction and Albuquerque. One of the right-of-way holders decided they wanted more money for their right-of-way on that 10-year agreement, to, a 7-figure above number, and it basically killed that path. So arrangements had to be made to try and circumvent that path. It provided the redundancy for a lot of things on the western slope, and that's honestly probably the largest rock you'll find. I know the electric companies and the Wyoming REA have looked at this. There's a particular one on the eastern side of the state that looked at deploying broadband, but again, pulled back because of the inherent costs of getting that. And to this point on electrical easements, WAPA, I'm not sure who understands most of that, but Western Area Power Authority is a government agency that transports all the electricity from the hydroelectric plants in the nation. Definitely plenty here in Wyoming, but there is discussion on their level as well of opening their electrical lines and access to carry commercial should the easement situation be relieved across the state and others. So that's the one stone, but we do have additional support.
Thank you. Ms. Sessions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ryan, for the information. I'm hoping that maybe you could speak briefly to some of the other challenges that industry faces in regards to permitting, particularly around state, federal, and railroad permits, and what perhaps we can do to facilitate that permitting.
Ryan?
Mr. Chairman. Yes, Ms. Sessions, this permitting is always a challenge, by and large, federal. Honestly, if we can through this group and even parts of even adding other Western states, because I don't think it's a independent problem, but I know there's significant issues in trying to gain permitting across federal lands, as well as state and local. I know some efforts have been made on the state level to put a one dig policy in place on YDOT right of ways, as well as others, to try and move and add to the fiber inventory on our state right of ways. So any efforts that can be made to streamline the permitting process and change that response from the state and federal levels would definitely be a boon to broadband, as well as even to the local entities. The process the processes there take a considerable amount of time, as franchise agreements and everything else have to be reached moving forward. So if any assistance can be provided there, not only do the larger local entities may have the staff to support it, what's even more interesting is the smaller entities that don't have the support or the funding to negotiate particular access also causes inherent problems. I hope that answered you, Mr. Chairman, session.
Thank you. Are there any other questions of Ryan? Senator Dockstader, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just taking it back, Ryan, you mentioned working with the Department of Education. We have two key people on this committee right now, Senator Wasserberger, who we reached out to just because of his experience with education, of course, the speaker too, and ask that you keep them looped into educational developments and broadband along the way, sir.
Ryan, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I must apologize. I was looking for Mr. Wasserberger and I've missed the question. Sorry.
I think Ryan, I think it was what Senator Dockstader basically said is we have two key people in this committee, Senator Wasserberger and Speaker Harshman, that are very involved in education, and so I think going forward the idea is to keep them really involved in what is happening on the education front. And Senator Wasserberger, please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to state that I don't feel myself as an expert on broadband, but I did do a lot of reading to prepare for this meeting. And one of the things that came across as a suggestion to improve broadband across the United States was exactly what Mr. Kadira was talking about, which was allowing I think electrical utilities, or like even rural electric associations, to take cable down their lines. And I thought to myself, one of the things that at least my district, from Gillette all the way to south of Douglas, I have just an incredible amount of students who are ranch kids like I was, and my ranch was 33 miles north of Lusk, and it's nothing compared to what some of my kids are 50 miles or 60 miles from places. And so just getting to school is something special, so that if we can get those students broadband through their electrical lines, we would do a lot. Think about all the opportunities we would have if students, instead of having snow days, you had remote learning days. And we would never have to miss another day of school. And we could also probably cheapen up some of our costs for schools by being able to do that. I don't think I'm ever will be in favor of not having students sit in a classroom and learn live. But I do think that technology and what we just went through with COVID and how the educators of the state stepped up and dealt with that issue, there's some good learning going on, and we could do maybe some learning over the summer so that we don't have summer learning loss. And so I just see this Wyoming, I just see as we're not really rural, we're remote. And even our largest town really isn't a city. It's, it's still a small community in most states' eyes. And so I see this broadband as just an opportunity to maybe expand our learning in Wyoming, but then also at the same time allow kids to stay home and maybe continue learning. I do believe that we're not through this COVID thing. If you study pandemics in past world history, there's typically 3 waves. And so just to keep our kids caught up, and I know that we're not going to be able to do this instantaneously, but if we could do it down the road. Anyway, that's my soapbox, and I'll get off of it. Thank you.
Speaker Harshman, and then I'll go to Representative Yen. Speaker Harshman, go ahead.
Yeah, my space bar doesn't work. Sometimes it works. Push the space bar and you can talk. Sometimes it doesn't. So it's not right now. But hey, just back to the electrical easements and Wyoming has a lot of other easements for pipelines, Ryan. And I was wondering if there's been talk about that, and similar to the utilities, I think a lot of the pipeline companies now use satellites or whatever for leak detection, those things. But they could probably run a dedicated fiber for their own, for valves, for pumps, for leak detection, but also, running some pipe for some fiber to serve these communities. And I was curious if other states are looking at that as well. Seems like a similar issue to the electrical poles.
Ryan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, Representative Harshman, it's as far as using pipeline right away for fiber optics, actually using the pipelines themselves is not a new technology. That actually was started, I don't know, over 20 years ago. A company that I knew as Wiltel, Level 3 acquired them, but Wiltel was a subsidiary of Williams Pipeline. They would take abandoned pipelines across the country, actually across the world, and instead of filling them with gas or oil, et cetera, they filled them with fiber cables. That led to its own inherent issues, obviously, but there's that right of way. The pipeline's already there. No need to even include conduit. You have a built-in conduit right there. As far as other states, as in the regulated side of it, providing legislation or access for building broadband alongside pipelines, I don't know what that looks like, but I can definitely find out. So yeah, it's not unheard of. In fact, I think, excuse me, to speak to Wiltel, excuse me, everybody watches what they built before, right? You always go by the house you lived by. My family doesn't like it, but I look at old fiber builds. We helped build across fiber across Wyoming 20 years ago. So Wiltel, something's going on at the Wiltel, and I think this came up at Joint Ed, is somebody's building across there with a larger capacity, 488 or some large capacity fiber there as well. I'm not sure who that is, but a little research, we can figure that out as well. But anyway, to answer your question, no, it's not a new thing as far as the regulated side of it. I don't have any information on opening those easements, but I can definitely find out.
Thank you, Ryan. Brian Fuller, just, in your notes, mark down, do note the electrical easement and other easements that exist in Wyoming that we might consider. Just to make sure we get that marked down. Representative Yin, did you add your hand up, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ryan, thanks for the presentation and all the information. I think you mentioned in your presentation that you are, in the last 72 hours, had some conversations with WREA. And I wonder if you could expound on what those conversations were, if they involved what we've been talking about, which is using the easements possibly for broadband. And I know when you mentioned the smart grid technology for the electric utilities, that they were actually providing fiber to the home already specifically for smart grid, but there are issues when you expand that to allowing it to allow for broadband access in the home. Is it the easements that need to be fixed for that, or what is the legislative fix, and is that something that we can do on the state level? And do you know, are there grants being provided on the federal level for that build out of the fiber to the home for the smart grid technology by the USDA or any other entity on the federal level? So thank you, and I look forward to hearing your answer.
Ryan, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, Representative Yin. Yeah, on the smart grid technology, because they're going to provide a monitoring to their substations, they build the fiber to the substation in the neighborhood, not necessarily to the home. And what you'll find, depending what they'll do in addition to that, is along the way they'll put in various frequency, probably 900 meg transponders to read meters, and that will actually suffice for their smart grid on the home. But to further answer your question, yeah, honestly, within the past 16 hours from Wyoming Rural Electric, they have been in conversation with this for some time, and they're real interested in continuing the conversation and try and help moving broadband forward across the state, whatever that looks like. So yeah, the responses have been has been positive, and they want to continue to come to the table with that as well.
Ryan, thank you. Just on an anecdotal thing there, and then I'll get to Senator Von Flattern. 3 years ago, I was asked to give a presentation to some ranchers on the Musselshell River in Montana. And we think we're remote in Wyoming, and we are, but the Musselshell in Montana is really remote. The population of that county, I think it was like Petroleum County, Montana, the population was like 800 people. And I got in, and I was allowed to stay at this ranch, and these folks, and I said, well, what about internet? What do you got for internet? Because I thought they'd have nothing. And they said, oh, we have fiber to the ranch. Fiber to the ranch. And it was brought in by their electric co-op through a federal grant in a county of 800 people. And they had fiber to the ranch. And so things are possible. We just have to connect those things. And Senator Von Flattern, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question is to do with Mr. Kudera. What he said, commercial private easement was what you would need to run the electrical. So in other words, the electrical would have to move into a commercial private easement to allow broadband to be put on the poles.
Ryan, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Von Flattern. Yes, currently, as it currently exists, the utility can string fiber to support smart grid, which is a utility-based connection, to go anything past that and offer a retail type connection, which when I say retail, that would be connectivity for another provider or connectivity to the home. That would require a change in easement by individual landowner from a utility easement to a commercial easement, as far as I understand, yes.
Senator Von Flattern, follow up?
Yes, I do. So Mr. Kudera, this would not be they would not have to move it. They would have to renegotiate the easement to allow the broadband to be put on the poles.
Ryan?
Mr. Chairman. Yes, sir. And I apologize not having pictures. This all happened so quickly, I wasn't able to provide more information, which I can in the future if you'd like. Look at your power lines along the highway when you travel outside of town, wherever you happen to be, and look at them. You'll typically see it's all three-phase. So there'll be 3 wires at the top, excuse me, on insulators, and then your static wire on the bottom. And in long haul operations or between towns, the high capacity stuff that you're not running right to the house, that's basically what's there is those 4 wires. If you go into town, you'll see on the distribution side, a lot of times there's additional things hanging underneath those 3 wires, those 4 wires, excuse me. Those 4 wires are all that's delivering electricity. Anything else attached to that pole is typically going to be communications, coax for cable TV, copper pairs for phones, and that's going to typically be in town. Once you get out of town, again, you go back to 4 wires and there's nothing else. And all it would entail was adding 1 more cable underneath the existing electrical infrastructure on those poles. And no, and to answer your question directly, no, it would not require any construction other than stringing of line on an existing pole line.
Thank you, Ryan. Representative Lindholm, I'm going to put you on the spot since this was your bailiwick for a while. So maybe you can tell us some of the challenges that exist in this area. Because I hate to put you on the spot, but I think you know what they are.
Somewhat. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So when we're talking about how utilities and transmission organizations are starting to connect fiber from substation to substation. That's typically called OPGW. So that's their static line that's being used. That static line has fiber internal of it. And that's typically what most of these larger transmission organizations are going to. And I mean, so that's for their own personal use. As far as dragging fiber along existing structures, those structures have been engineered and built for depending on what type of load they're carrying, what size of conductor they're carrying, those types of things. My personal opinion on it is I think you start talking to rural electrics that, hey, you're going to have to start doing this, and the cost is going to be pretty big. But as far as moving down the line towards perfecting the right of way, I think we could probably call on the Wyoming Rural Electric Association. I'm sure they would probably be in favor of something like that, or for that purpose, to be able to start moving down that road. Yeah, there's a lot to take into consideration there. OPGW though is generally, I think, the direction that a lot of these utilities, most transmission companies have gone that direction already. I also heard earlier that WAPA, Western Area Power Administration, does all your hydroelectrics. While they certainly do some hydroelectrics, they also own coal generation, and they also own several other types of generation. But Western only owns essentially, it's kind of weird, like over in Senator Dockstetter's neck of the woods, their power is coming not from WAPA, but from Bonneville Power. And Bonneville Power is another government entity that owns a considerable amount of generation in the Montana area, Western Wyoming, Idaho, those types of areas. So there is a possibility there. I think that could be advantageous, but I would hesitate to say anything in regards to stringing something else on utility lines out in the rural areas without talking to WREA.
Ms. Sessions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to provide a little color, if I may, I don't think this is anything that is new. For example, Silver Star and Lower Valley Energy partner on several instances where we hang our transmission fiber along the power line route, specifically between Jackson and Star Valley. So I believe that is nothing that's new. I think it's already happening.
Thank you. Senator Dockstetter.
Thank you. Just as a quick follow-up, maybe just a sidebar too. I wish everybody could have a Silver Star or a Lower Valley Energy in their area. But in the meantime, just checking in, and we'll kind of expedite this. Mr. Taylor letting me know that the Wyoming Rural Electric Association is already talking about legislation to perfect the right-of-ways to allow for broadband. So something's already in the works there, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And we'll keep an eye on that and take a look at that and what committee that might be in, whether it's in education or where it's at. So I think if there's no other questions, we have all of the presenters are supposed to be done by 10:45. Obviously, we're not going to get there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a short. This is a JAC 5-minute break. And so we will all come back at about 10:16 and continue with the next presenter. Thank you. Well, thank you. I guess we're starting to rejoin. And we'll restart the meeting, and we are on overview of broadband in Wyoming. And now we're going to go to Director Knopp if he is here, and we're going to talk about the Wyoming Unified Network. Director?
Good morning. Can you guys hear me?
We can. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. I unmuted everything appropriately. Sometimes that's a challenge. So thank you, Chairman Summers, for the opportunity to visit with you guys. And it's been a very interesting conversation so far this morning that we've been able to listen to. We've been asked to provide an overview of the Wyoming Unified Network. And to do that, I'll turn that over to Jason Miller, who has put together a presentation for you guys as a quick overview.
Thank you, Jason. Please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Gordon said, we do have a little presentation. I'd like to thank everybody for letting us have a discussion about the Unified Network and where we're at right now, where we're trying to take the state network itself. With me here, I also have our Deputy State CIO, Rick Fortney. He's also our Deputy Director for ETS. I am Jason Miller. I'm the IT Administrator here for ETS. Been here for about 6 years or so. So let me see if I can share this presentation real quick. Everybody see that okay?
I do see that. Thank you, Jason. Please continue.
Perfect. All right. All right. So prior to 2013, this is kind of what the network looked like for the state of Wyoming. There were community colleges, various state agencies, and schools all connected through long haul, like T1 connections. Some were fiber, a lot were just ATM DSLs. So very, very low bandwidth, low throughput connectivity. We also had just one internet service provider here out of Cheyenne. It was a 5 gig connection, divided up half and half between state and the educational entities in the network here. Obviously, with this design, and I came from Whiteout, so I was at Whiteout back from 1998. So I went through a lot of the growing pains of the network piece of this. And obviously, with this kind of design, there's issues with redundancy and availability. So there were significant issues with outages either to the ISP or equipment in this physical building that I'm sitting in right now that may fail, that would cause an outage. And when that happened, the whole state of Wyoming went dark. So as I was looking into the jobs here at ETS when we were looking to build out the unified network piece, the enticing part was some of the redundancy and the availability and pieces that we were looking to build into the network, both for the educational K-12 community college, as well as the state agencies, which was obviously where I came from, where I was looking to continue to grow. So after 2013, we started building the unified network through a lot of different pieces, and all of this is built directly on all provider provided networks, provider fiber connections. There's 8 unified network cores here in Cheyenne, Laramie, Rock Springs, Jackson, Riverton, Casper, Basin, and Sheridan. Those were picked to be able to regionalize network traffic. So the intention here is that a school and or state office in, say, Converse County will connect to that Casper core office or core building, and then route around the unified network to the various internet service providers that we have. The intention is to provide redundancy of the backbone. All of these are 100 gig circuits. Redundancy of the backbone so that one, or in certain cases, 2 fiber cuts is not going to jeopardize the validity of the traffic. It'll still be able to get to the internet. You'll still be able to get to whatever resources on the network itself. Obviously, on this design, this is where we're at right now, as we just built out and awarded the most recent circuits. We now have 4 internet providers connected to the unified network. Each of those is a 10 gig drain from the network itself. And we picked these locations specifically so that we have we have the ability to, like I said, if there's multiple fiber cuts, say between Riverton and Casper and Sheridan, they can still route up through the ISP that comes out of Sheridan, or they can route to the ISP over in Rock Springs. So we should have a very dynamic way of getting traffic around the network, so that a fiber cut isn't gonna stop any kind of traffic from moving around the network itself. The next slide here. So I kind of want to talk about what makes up a core, because it's been a conversation with lots of folks in the past. So when I say a core of the unified network, it basically starts with, this is the core router. This is the router that resides at those locations, and then there's one at each one of the core locations there. This router is connected to all the other MLXs across the network through those 100 gig circuits that we were just talking about. So this is what creates that true backbone. This is what moves that traffic across the network. Everything aggregates through these devices. And as I said before, there are 4 different locations on the network where those ISPs then tie into this physical device, and that's how the decision on where your traffic is going, whether it goes out to the internet or to the next MLX, to the next location. These are the devices also where all the colleges, schools, and state offices are terminated. So when we order a circuit, it's from a school A to this core location, and this is the device that handles that specific connection. This is the device that secures those kind of devices across the network, so they communicate appropriately to the right locations. So all locations in those regionalized areas connect to their specific core location, their specific router that provides that kind of connection. We also have redundant firewalls at those locations, specifically for state offices. These are the devices that provide the security zones, either between state and state traffic, or state and internet, or even state and the data centers. So these are the devices that make sure we maintain our security posture for each individual state, no matter what your federal requirements are. These are the devices that handle those kind of things.
Jason?
Yes.
Jason, this is Representative Summers. I have a quick question for you on, so is each core bid out, or are you going to go through that? How is this bid out to providers? And what opportunities do they have? What allows them to make a bid? I would assume it would be they have to have that infrastructure in place, that fiber in place within those. So is each core bid out? Kind of go through that process as you talk about this as well.
Sure, yeah, Chairman Summers. The physical hardware is bid out when the equipment itself actually goes nears end of life, which is what we're getting into the next 2 years. So the physical hardware, whether, right now we have Brocade MLXs in there, we will offer up what services we need, and then any provider, of the broadband physical equipment folks can certainly bid on that, as well as the firewalls. We're going to bid those out and go from there on who responds and who can perform at those levels. As far as the circuits related to all of these, whether it be state offices, schools, those are all bid out on 3-year cycles. So the 100 gig circuits were just bid out over the last 6 months or so, and just awarded over the last, I think, month or two. So each one of those 100 gig circuits are bid out, like I said, every 3 years. We put them out for competitive bid and go through the award process through the matrix of how we award the circuits themselves.
So Jason, how many circuits are there that can be bid out, that there's opportunities for providers to bid on? So how many circuits?
On the unified network, there's 10 100 gig circuits. And then as far as the local school district and state circuits, there's, I have to get a specific number for there. It's in the ballpark of about right around 1,000 circuits individual for schools, state offices, and colleges that we provide from the state of Wyoming.
So Jason, just to make sure I understand this, this is good information. So if I were to take my one school district, two school districts in Suba County, each school district would have its own circuit that would be bid out, and then prospective telecoms could bid on that circuit. Is that correct?
Correct. And I'll get into how the school districts are designed in the next slide. We can certainly talk about that there, or Chairman.
Please go ahead.
All right. Any other questions on the hardware of a unified network core?
Rep. Summers, Mr. Chair.
Please go ahead, Representative Yin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jason, just a question on the utilization. Do you know what the peak utilization of the circuits that go to the wider internet is?
Chairman Summers, Representative again. Last time we checked, we run about a 12 aggregate across all of them, about 12 gig worth of utilization out to various ISPs.
So Jason, this is Representative Summers. So 12 gig out of 100 gig?
So Chairman, so what I'm referring to is specifically the connections from the unified network to the various internet providers. So like I said, we have 4 10 gig circuits there. So there's 40 gig of total aggregate to the internet. You are correct, though, that would also pertain to the 100 gig circuits themselves. As they route around the network, there is a little bit more there. We see about 16 gig or so on the 100 gig networks of average utilization. And that was when everybody was in schools and in the office, right? And some of that difference there is that there's a lot of traffic from the state side that goes to our state data center that doesn't go out to the internet side of the world. So that's why there's a little discrepancy there. So hopefully that answered your question.
So Jason, just to put this in simpler terms for me. So basically right now at its highest peak, you might say 16% of the unified network capacity is being utilized. Is that a fair statement?
Mr. Chairman, yes, I'd agree.
All right. Representative Yin, do you have any follow-up on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think if we're saying that the maximum throughput to the wider internet out of our 4 connections is 40, and our current utilization to that wider internet is 12, we're still saying that if we allow other people to connect into the unified network, we're currently at 30%. So we have about 70% of peak utilization that I wouldn't necessarily want to hit the cap, but we're currently using 30%. Is that correct? Of the wider internet that we have available connected to the unified network.
Jason?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, yes, that is correct. And we do have the ability to scale those circuits from 10 gig to 40 gig to 100 gig if the need were to arise. So that is built into our model as we awarded these.
Thank you. Jason, please go ahead unless there's any other questions on I think we're kind of on the hardware side of it.
Yeah.
And if you do, just holler because I can't see all the pictures. So please go ahead. Jason.
Thank you, Chairman. All right, so basic school district design, and again, I'm trying not to get too deep into the weeds on this. Our goal for the 2019 awards was that every school district aggregation will be at 1 gigabit or better. And now aggregation, what I mean on that is from the school district, it goes through their firewall and then an edge switch that the state of Wyoming provides to that school district. And that's that connection from that edge switch to the core router that we just talked about in one slide ago. That connection for every school district is at least 1 gigabit. As it goes out, there are some that are now at 10 gig. So, and that's all based on the traffic of the school district themselves. Then, as you can see inside, each one of the school districts is kind of designed as a hub and spoke kind of network. So all of these dotted lines between the school admin building is aggregation location. All of those dotted lines are leased services. So all of those are purchased through providers, various providers across the state. We have We have contracts, I believe, with about 12 or 13 of them. So those are the ones that I was talking about previously, that those are bid every 3 years. On a cycle, we bid the entire school district network all in one large chunk for the U8 compliance piece. It makes it much easier to do the paperwork and all of those kind of things. So all of those circuits are available to all the providers, whoever wants to bid on them every 3 years.
Jason, a question on the every 3 years. Has it always been bid out every 3 years? Is every 3 years sort of an industry standard for a bid out? And as you answer that question, I would also like to hear from Barbara a little bit what she understands about industries. I'm sure, you know, you'd make an investment, you got to hold that investment for a period of time. There's also value from the person bidding it out to do it as often as possible to get more competition. So I'd like to hear, Jason, what's been the standard? Where did you come up with 3 years? And then back to Barbara on kind of talk about industry side of that equation.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, since I've been with ETS, it has been every 3 years. When I first started here in 2013, we were in the middle of bidding out the education circuits. That was the beginning of the unified network build out. So that was in 2013, and then we of course did it again in 2016, and then right now 2019 was the last award cycle. We kind of landed on that cycle, and it was kind of a balance between, do you want to be locked in for 5 years and pay a slightly lower cost based on you know, like you said, if you're paying for that installation of equipment or that build of fiber over a longer term. It really, I think from my understanding of the conversations, it was more that was the sweet spot to, as you said, kind of continue to encourage some of that competition, encourage some of that growth of fiber into communities. So we continue to, as we continue to bid circuits, we continue to prioritize fiber delivered services so that all the providers see the direction that we're taking the state network in hopes that it would then spur some of that communication for communities as well.
Ms. Sessions, if you have any thoughts on this, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I would just add that there is significant investment in both the hardware and the construction side. And 3 years, while we love to have an ROI that pays us back in 3 years, that's a pretty substantial investment to have to rebid every 3 years.
So I guess my question back to you, Ms. Sessions, would be, and this is, you know, that there is that sweet spot, right? So is 3 years, one, we want to have robust competition for these circuits. That's in the best interest of the state. Ultimately, the best interest for everybody if there's more fiber in an area. So do you think 3 years is working pretty well? Do you think it should have been a different number? Just your thoughts.
I guess Mr. Chairman, I would say that it would be a minimum of 3 years. You know, our hopes is that you'll win the bid for the additional 3 years, and that's where that sweet spot kind of kicks in. I guess that would be my remarks as far as that goes.
Thank you. Jason, go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman Summers. And to continue the conversation just on school districts, our goal is to have a minimum of 50 meg per school across the board. We were at one point looking at a low water mark of 100 kilobits per student or 200, which is kind of the conversations we had back in 2013 and then 2016. As some of these bids came through, we started more looking at it as the best way to invest some of our resources to provide connectivity to the students, to look for that long-term goal where we wanted to land with connectivity in the schools. Hoping again, like I said before, to be able to provide some of that additional learning resources, whether it be, you know, on site or, you know, anywhere else. And then a lot of those requirements, a lot of those opportunities come at the backbone of the network itself. So to that point, we're currently sitting with the awards that we got for 2019 at 2.4 meg per student on average across the entire all the school districts. So obviously there's some a little higher, some a little lower, but so that's a significant increase from where we were back in 2013 when we were shooting for the 100K per student. So any questions on school district connectivity or anything else I can clear up for anyone before I move on?
Ms. Sessions, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of follow-ups. I guess one is more of a clarification. So when I look at the links on ETS websites that talks about the unified network, just to clarify, you are just talking about the 100 gig core backbone, correct? Or does that include, when you're talking a unified network, does that include the branches that go off to the schools and the state buildings?
Chairman Summers,
please.
Are you speaking, Barbara, specifically to the 2.4 meg per student, or what?
Sorry, just the design of the unified network. Is that specifically just the 100 gig core backbone, or does that include the spokes?
Jason, go ahead.
Chairman, the unified network itself is both, right? So like I said, back in 2013, it was the two networks, the state network, the executive branch network, and the school district network were completely separate networks. They all home run back here to the Emerson building here in Cheyenne. When we built that 100 gig backbone, that was kind of the initial discussion of the unified network with the intention of unifying these services to the executive branch and the school districts onto this backbone to then be able to provide them a little bit better redundancy and resiliency. There are still education circuits and there are still state provided circuits, but they're two sides of the same coin now, as opposed to before they were completely two separate things. Does that answer your question? I hope.
Ms. Sessions.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Follow up if I could, please.
Please go ahead.
In your meeting the other morning, when you talked to the education committee, you talked about a 1.5 megabits per student average. What's the difference between that and this 2.4?
Jason.
Chairman Summers, Barbara, the difference between those two was the numbers we had prior to the award of the 2019 circuits. So this is just truly, like I said, this is the most up to date from the information we had after the award from a couple months back.
Jason, just a quick note, and once again, anybody that wants to raise their hand, just jump in, because I want to see the presentation too, so I can't see everybody's hand. But Jason, how many school districts are there school districts that don't use the unified network, that don't feel it provides enough and they're doing their own thing?
Chairman Summers, all of the school districts are connected to the unified network. State of Wyoming provides that aggregation circuit, that 1 gig circuit that we've talked about, from their edge switch to the unified network core routers. All the school districts have those circuits provided. Some districts have elected to purchase a redundant connection outside of that, in case for some reason we have a hardware problem, or that is a single point of failure truly between that last mile connection from our core router to that school district aggregation building. Is certainly a single run of fiber, right, that could be cut, could cause outages, and we've seen that in the past. So there are some schools that have purchased a redundant secondary connection just directly to the internet, and then they fail over between those two, which is certainly, well within their means to be able to do. There are also some school districts that elect to build and or fund their internal connections from their aggregation location to their elementary schools and junior highs. There are some schools that decide to purchase and or build fiber for those specific schools themselves, in which case then the state of Wyoming doesn't provide any other redundant connection, because that would violate the E-rate rules.
Jason, thank you. And I think the E-rate rules are pretty interesting. So, I mean, that is the federal dollars that can be used to help support education internet. Jason, one thing that you may find out for us later, and I don't know, I think it'll be a tough task, but I think it's worth finding out, is how much and what are we spending, and what are districts spending on on internet connections. So what are districts spending to support a more robust system than perhaps this? And is there a reason that we can't maybe provide that differently? And so if you could get, I think it'll be hard to do, but maybe one thing for you to find out is what are we spending on internet out there in school districts, and why can't we do that through the unified network? So please continue.
And Chairman Summers, that's certainly something we can look into, and there are other options to provide redundant connectivity to the schools. And again, some of the E-rate rules, limit the ability to be able to get E-rate dollars for a redundant connection. But like I said, from a technical point of view, they could certainly also have, we can provide another connection from that administration building to a different unified network core to be able to provide that same kind of redundancy. And it's a conversation I've had with a few school districts. Generally, their redundant connectivity is less than what we provide as far as, like I said, the 1 gig connection. They may purchase a 100 meg connection, that kind of thing. And purely that's it seems more just for a backup in case something were to go down. But we can certainly look to see if we can find some of the E-rate filings for what those internet connections are.
Thank you. Please continue.
All right, so the next slide is just how state agencies are connected, which is similar to schools, but changes a little bit of the dynamic. Some of the goals that I'm chasing for the next few years is aligning the circuit contracts with the building leases. As you know, there's a lot of state agencies lease buildings around the state of Wyoming. And we want to be able to respond when agencies need to move from one location to the next, with being able to align some of those contracts where we don't have to pay any additional TLAs or work through the movement of a circuit. Most of the providers are more than willing to move a circuit. We just need to work on the timing of it. So that's something that I've been had in the forefront of what we want to accomplish on the circuit side of things. And then also as a way to consolidate some of the funds spent is we have a lot of locations where there are multiple agencies in, say, a strip mall, where you might have 3 or 4 agencies in there, and currently 3 or 4 of them have their own connections back to the state network, all paying their own individual cost. There's a benefit that we could have by increasing the capacity of a single circuit to that location, and then consolidating all of those agencies onto that one circuit, reduce some costs and increase the performance of the network that they have there. So that's been a goal of ours as well. And as we continue to build out some of this network, we're shooting for a 30 by 30 symmetrical service at as many as many executive branch agencies as we can. Reason for that is the 4th bullet there is to be able to support additional enterprise services, whether it be our voice services, wireless access, all of those things. As you get to a symmetrical service or at least a licensed wireless service, opens up additional opportunities so that we don't need to have local key systems or something like that at the executive branch agencies.
Just a quick note there, Jason, and sorry for calling. I'm going to call on Barbara again, just because I know her well enough. I can pick on her a little bit. I really like the mention of this 30 by 30, and it's something that I think, and the question back to Barbara is does that seem to be, so this is 30 up and 30 down, I'm assuming a symmetrical 30, and so it's upload and download. Does that seem to be a fairly common standard in, let's say, business today, to what service they need to really be able to work online, do these Zooms online? So Barbara, what are you seeing out there for the needs for symmetrical service at what level?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In my opinion, just what we're seeing here is that 30 by 30 is not necessarily the standard for businesses. We're seeing requests for much higher services, more up around the 100 symmetrical or higher for business services.
Okay, thank you. Jason, please continue.
Mr. Chairman, just quickly as a follow-up then, are we falling short based on Ms. Sessions' comments?
Senator Dockstader, thank you. Jason, does the 30 by 30 seem to be adequate for, obviously governmental entities is not the same as business, but we do many of the same functions in government. So does 30 by 30 adequate?
Chairman Summers, right. So some of this goes into how we're trying to consolidate the funds and get an understanding of where all of the circuit funds on the executive branch are spent, right? So this is right now where our base right now, honestly, is a 10 by 10 for the agencies that can afford it. So some of this is a financial decision. That's why I'm saying it's a minimum of 30 by 30. I absolutely agree that I would very much like to have better capacities. But there's a lot of locations we're talking about a 1 or 2 person driver's license shop. So there's a little bit of logic behind both of those. I'm trying to stand behind the 30 by 30 as a minimum for those 1 to 2 person locations, just for that fact that we need to be able to continue to grow, but I also need to be aware of the funds that we spend on those circuits. Our larger capacity locations, absolutely, we generally get 1 gig symmetrical services to those kind of locations. But it's more of a we analyze the location and the number of people at that location, and then go from there. So to say, I absolutely, like I said, I absolutely agree that a 100 meg circuit is definitely better for some of our locations, depending on the work that they do and where they're at. It's just not financially viable to provide that kind of connection.
Jason, you might briefly touch on, so an agency expense, it's an enterprise, kind of an enterprise accounting fund that they have to provide in their budget back through you all and then ultimately through us in the legislature. How much money do we spend annually on the unified network as a state? And how much of that is split between the three entities, school districts, state agencies, and colleges? How do we break that down? What's the percentage of each, and how much money annually do we spend on the unified network?
Mr. Chairman, I'd have to get specific numbers on the community colleges, as those are paid out of the Education Foundation side of our budget. So our budget's kind of broken in between, or into the general fund side and then the school foundation side. So the community colleges fall into the Education Foundation funding piece of that. On that side on the school foundation side, the expenses for all of those circuitry, and again, like Barbara was saying, we're certainly providing larger capacity circuits to the schools. But on that side, our biennium expenses is right around $13 million on circuits. And that includes half of the cost of the 100 gig circuits, because those are split half school foundation and half general fund, because they share both traffic. And then of course we get the E-rate returns based on the percentage of free and reduced lunch on that side. On the general fund side, that's
Mr. Chairman?
Ms. Sessions, please.
Sorry, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I ask a quick follow-up question to that, Mr. Miller? So if 50% of the allocation is for the school foundation, does that, I'm assuming that then means that whatever state or other entities were to jump on that 100 gig network would have to split the additional capacity? Is that accurate?
Jason, please.
Chairman Summers, yes, I would agree. And we've not, if we're talking about allowing other locations or other pieces on there, absolutely, we'd have to allocate that out appropriately, because we have to keep the E-rate side whole and square. So as we add different pieces to that, we have to change how that model looks. So yes, and that would have to be discussion as we get to any of those kind of things.
Jason, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman Summers. On the general fund side, that's where we're trying to do the work this biennium to kind of get a handle on where all the circuit money is at between the agencies and what ETS funds. So right now, from our rough estimates, it looks like it's right around $8 million on the general fund side, and where we're trying to see where we can get some benefit to looking at this and spending spending dollars a little more intelligently is that we have quite a few agencies that spend a lot of money on circuitry. There are a lot of agencies that don't spend, and that kind of creates the combined office problem where you have that strip mall where you have two agencies that for one reason or another haven't budgeted for additional circuitry. I'm not able to afford a broadband circuit. So we're looking at a better way to be able to handle that kind of issue. Kind of taking the model that we had from the education side, where we had the pool of money for the education foundation funds, and we're able to bring up capacity across all of the school circuits. Looking to do the same thing over on the state agency circuits, where we can get a handle of what we're actually spending. I mean the collective state of Wyoming spend on executive branch circuits, and then what it would take to bring them up to a 30 by 30 or a 50 by 50 or something along those lines. That's kind of the goal of what we're looking at for understanding and getting a handle on where we're at with the general fund and the executive branch side of connectivity.
Thank you. Is that the end of your presentation?
Yes. So the only thing that I wanted to touch on here is again, when we talk the symmetrical services for our state executive branch side, they do have a lot of their data is consolidated in the state data center. So that's where a lot of that upload speed is important for our side as well, not only for those enterprise services, like I said, the voice services and those kind of things, but they also have a lot of resources that are moved farther away from the end user. And as we know, and Ryan actually touched on it a little bit, the farther we move that data away from the user, more latency becomes important. The more these bandwidth discussions become important. So with that, I will certainly stand for any questions.
So I think if we go to the larger screen now, if we quit sharing that screen. Jason, I'm going to throw a question back to you. Jason is also a member of the Broadband Advisory Council. And I guess I would ask him, this is strictly, Jason as a member of that council, not necessarily Jason as a state agency. So you've wrestled, and I know you were on the task force that dealt with new technologies, what's going to happen in the next 20 years, 10 years, 5 years as this blows up. But if you had two, or even one, if you had one or two suggestions on how to move the needle with broadband, what would they be? What would you see? What do you see out there as you have served on this council now for 2 years that we need to do, or that we could do as a state to really move the needle?
Well, Chairman Summers, I think from that point of view, I would absolutely say that the number one thing we need to do is find a way to streamline the ability for our providers to be able to get fiber into the ground, to be able to provide decent quality, high speed connections to the household. We've talked fiber to the house, which I think should be the goal. When we talk branches and all of that kind of thing, and obviously, let's start with fiber to the household across the state of Wyoming, and let's then figure out how we need to get those kind of things. Because as you guys said, we're as Gordon likes to say, we're a frontier state. We're not just rural. So as we're looking at those kind of things, fiber to the household should always be the goal, which is exactly what we do from the state side on the school district circuits. Fiber is our goal. Do we hit that goal every time? No, because of various other reasons. But there's no reason that fiber, building that foundation of fiber in the state of Wyoming should be the goal. And being able to streamline the ability to get the providers to be able to get to end, I think should be 1A. And then we always have to keep in our back pocket that fiber is not going to be available to everybody everywhere. We need to be able to do this in bits and pieces. So again, there's going to be a place for the wireless connectivity, that kind of stuff. There's a lot of stuff going on that side. And even in the near future, like you said, the emerging technology stuff, the low Earth orbit stuff will be a great opportunity for a lot of rural Wyoming as we continue to build this fiber. I mean, everything we just said is not a 6-month answer. It's a 10-year. I mean, it takes time. It takes commitment. It takes continued commitment from all of us on this call, from all of us in the legislature, from all of us on the provider community. We really have to lock arms and work together to get this done. And it can't be just one group doing this and one community has all this great. We need to lift everybody up through that. So that'd be my personal side from the Broadband Council thought on how we can address some of that stuff.
I appreciate that. Ms. Hardesty, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate both of these presentations and these conversations, and have kind of kept quiet just to continue to learn. And one of the things I keep hearing is quite a bit of conversation about the education system. I really appreciate, Jason, what you mentioned about the importance of fiber to the home, because for a long time, and definitely highlighted during this COVID pandemic, we have significant numbers of patients and providers who are delivering critical healthcare services from their households and to their households, and in all of our work with healthcare providers, patients, specialty clinics who are in state as well as out of state, is there's still significant issues with being able to access technologies and services via the home. So thank you, Jason, for bringing that up. And I know that's been discussed in a couple of other presentations today. So it's not necessarily a question as much as a statement to hopefully this conversation will continue to be about all sectors, as well as just the highlighted importance of making sure that that individual households and of course then other businesses are a key priority for this work. So thank you.
Thank you. Senator Dockstader, please.
Mr. Miller, appreciate your excellent summary, but with proper planning and proper funding, we could maybe turn that 10-year plan into a 5-year plan or less, maybe.
Jason.
Chairman Summers, Senator Dockstader, I think with possibly, the reason why I'm hesitant a little bit is that when I've worked extensively with a lot of the providers around the state to build the network we just talked about. Wyoming certainly has some interesting hurdles that those folks have to cross. So yeah, we could certainly plan, and I think a lot of that comes from planning at the local level as it grows to the state level. How those networks tie into each other, those kind of things. And I don't mean necessarily the unified network. I mean the provider networks across the state. It would be a hard one for me to answer exactly how long it would take. I've talked to a few other groups that have done a lot of fiber builds, and it's the hard work of what the providers do to put fiber in the ground is a very new discussion to me. But as I'm talking to those folks, it's certainly something that is a long-term prospect. It's a long-term plan. And you want to continue to keep developing that as we go. So you could certainly focus on certain areas to build out those areas, but then you always have another area to go to. And as you go, you continue to learn, you continue to build in that fashion. I think you could certainly, if you planned it out and had enough funding, you could certainly step it up. I would think, but there will be hurdles with, most of those will be granite rocks and those kind of things. But I would think, and like I said, I'd rather lean on the providers to answer truly what that timeline is. But that's what I've learned just from talking to a few of the other states that have done stuff similar to this, other counties that have done stuff similar to this.
Thank you. Senator Landon, please.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Mr. Miller, thanks again for today and for last week. I still have a lot to learn on this front, but two things. One side of the coin, I hear a lot from my constituents about who know about the unified network. And they ask, why is it that we're not utilizing that superhighway to more capacity? But then the flip side of that, anytime we bring up access to that unified network, it's a real hot button. And I get that. I've been here throughout the time that we've established that network, and a lot of sensitivity by most of us on the legislature that it was not our intention to shut out private enterprise at all. I guess my question to you, Jason, would be, what sort of things can we think about, particularly in light of COVID? This pandemic has shined a light on some things. That's why we said education and telehealth, or at least the healthcare network in Wyoming, might be two areas that we could benefit during this time. Is that unified network a piece that we could talk about a public-private partnership? Can you talk a little bit about that, or maybe hint as to some pitfalls, or what can we do, for example, to set our hospital association, our network out there of clinics and hospitals to give better access? Can you speak a little bit about that for me? Thank you.
Jason, go ahead. Thank you.
Chairman Summers, Senator Landon. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. The unified network, obviously it's built, and right now it's built for the executive branch, state government agencies, and school districts, within allowances for Supreme Courts or courts and the legislative branch to be able to connect if they so choose. So right now we're strictly limited to that piece. If you're talking, so we'll put that aside then, right? If you're talking rural health clinics, those kind of things, and connection back to the unified network for then a further connection to a hospital or something like that. On the technical side, there's no reason why that can't be done. We have the equipment to do it now. You know, that goes back into one of those slides I had, what makes up a core, right? The reason why I wanted that to be in everybody's mind is that when we talk about connecting a rural health clinic in, say, Farson, right? If we're going to connect that rural health clinic in Farson, say, to the Rock Springs core, now you're putting a lot of people's livelihood or life on the line, for lack of a better term. Maybe a little dramatic there, right? For that equipment that we have there. So what we'll have to make sure we do, if and when we go down these roads, we'll have to make sure that we have, again, the right ability to support the hardware that supports all of these connections, that supports that person on the end of the line. So it's absolutely not a technical thing. And honestly, from a technical point of view, you get a rural health clinic that's connected to the unified network. And then we have a fiber connection. We don't have one right now, but we get a fiber connection to various hospitals around the state that may be providing those services. And what we would do is we peer with that network. So we're not actually inside their networks, but the network themselves talk to each other, not through the internet, but just through the local fiber we have. So what that provides is a highly secure, highly efficient, and a quick connection between that remote office and any major hospital that we would be peered with. Again, there would be construction, there'd be some build happening there, but that certainly is a benefit. And I'm talking a little bit outside because the rural health clinics are something I'm still learning how the networks work and what they need and where they need services from. But for all intents and purposes, that's why we built the unified network, was to allow multiple people to access a common resource quickly and efficiently and redundantly, right? whether we're talking data at our data centers or some other location. That's kind of the reason. That's kind of the reason that's there. Again, it's not a technical problem. I would want to make sure that we have the right. I would want to make sure we have the right resources in place here at our network operations center to be able to respond to that, because, you know, as I talk to my network folks, it's not, you know, it's really easy to sit behind your keyboard and know it's just ones and zeros, but, you know, at the end of that ones and zeros, there's an actual live person on the end that's really dependent on that person that is intaking, whether it be a DFS office is intaking a child or someone doing telemedicine at a remote site. It's highly important that if and when issues occur, they're resolved and addressed appropriately. So that was a long answer to your question. Hopefully I got to it, but.
Are there, Senator Landon, please follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not to belabor, but just sort of a follow-up comment. It feels like to me that there ought to be a way for us to get there on the medical front. And again, I want to state, I have no desire to take away any of our private enterprise out there at all. In fact, I'd like to figure out a way to enhance it. But when we have the ability for all of our schools to talk to each other, it sure makes sense to me, Mr. Chairman, that we ought to talk about how do we make sure that our hospitals and our clinics can talk to each other as well. That might be a hinge point where some of this federal stimulus dollar might be set up to help us. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And Ms. Sessions, please. Yeah, I think it's your turn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Senator Landon. I think there are opportunities where hospitals and clinics can talk to each other via a network. I just don't think it needs to be the unified network. There are technologies like SD-WAN that can facilitate that as part of a private solution.
Ms. Sessions, just a follow up. This is probably as good a time as any to have some of this conversation. You know, is there a way, whether you did it through the unified network or you created another network that was bid out? Ultimately, providers are still going to have the opportunity to bid on individual pieces of all of this. Or if you had a different network, you would still, a private network, you would still have the ability to build that out or not. So how do we, and this is a long-term question, right? This isn't just for this moment that we're talking about now, but as we go forward in this process for at least the next couple of weeks, how do we as a state make sure we have the right telehealth between our clinics? The last mile is still going to be you all getting to the last mile, but how do we do this in a way that doesn't break you all, because these institutions are an important piece of your ROI as you move into a community and you want to provide the last mile to me for my telehealth. You also, you know, you rely on these institutions to help fund your ROI as well. So how do we mesh these two? Is there a way that we could provide you funding, for example, and still get to this kind of unified, dedicated streams? Because really what the unified network could do is it could provide dedicated fiber in between all of these clinics where they can talk to each other readily and have redundancy. And so how do we navigate this to do more better than what we are today?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the question is, what's the end game? Are we looking for a network so that they can talk? Is that what the medical industry really wants? Or are we looking for fiber to each location? Because I think in the state of Wyoming, we have the majority of at least hospitals with fiber connectivity. The beauty of SD-WAN is that it can take some of these other connectivity types, bring them into a network that would allow for efficient use and prioritization of the telehealth solution. So I think there are technical ways to accomplish what it is that the medical industry is after. We just need to determine what exactly that is. Is it the network? Is it connectivity? Is it both? And then I think there are solutions out there.
Thank you. And I think that this is an issue that we're going to need to, we'll keep working on. Obviously, in the bills, you will see some of this. So any other questions of Jason before we move on? I'm not seeing any hands. So we're going to move on. Representative Lindholm's shaking his head, so we're moving on. So our next speaker is WyoLink is Director Reiner with Department of Transportation, and he is here to talk a little bit about cell towers versus WyoLink versus one big policy. And he has a very, very long 72-page deal that we're hoping gets probably shortened up a bit. Otherwise, we will be here a long, long time. So Director Reiner, please go forth. You are muted, Director. You got your mute on. Thank you.
My apologies. Thank you. Thank you very much there, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Hey, I'll tell you, I am joined today with Mr. Troy Babbitt, and we do have a presentation that we'll walk through, which really answers the questions that you asked us a couple weeks ago and tries to walk you through really the details that were involved with that. Certainly, our focus throughout this entire issue is to support the state and our communities in this quest to rapidly get on to broadband. So if I could ask really to share the screen and turn ask Mr. Babbitt to show up the first slide.
Mr. Babbitt, please go ahead, and I know it's a lot of pages, but I would appreciate it, a fairly fast pace if you're going to go through all of them.
Are you able to see that screen?
I am,
okay.
Mr. Babbitt, thank you.
Director Reiner, do you want me to handle that, or did you want to walk through them?
Let me, Mr. Chairman, I'll take the lead on this, and we'll go through it at a high level, and if there's details, we'll just dig in here. So,
perfect, thank you.
Just in terms of the WyoLink recap, we spent a lot of time talking about a WyoLink the last time. The quick summary is, hey, it's a radio, not cell. It's been around, for about 15 years. And we say, and what we experience is it's working very well. And you can see the stats, 500 plus users a day, and you can scan down the stats to see what they are. I think a couple key points as we look at the potential to leverage these WyoLink towers onto these other systems is the towers are currently located, to support a statewide command and control network, not necessarily as local comms in sort of a tactical sense of the term. And I think the other issue there would be currently 78 towers, and we have 15 that are under contract right now. Let me go to the next slide. And Mr. Chairman, here is a quick recap of where the towers are. And unless there's specific questions on here, I don't see any reason for us to spend any time. I would note that the yellow, the square dots, or the squares are where the new towers are coming online. I would tell you that we have Buffalo up and running, and the troopers are already saying thank you very much because their comms are significantly better. Let me see if there's any questions. Next slide then. In terms of sharing our towers with internet service providers, we are currently doing that on a number, not many, less than 10. And really, the discussion becomes all of, hey, how was it built? How much, how are we going to work in tandem? We offer it out there. I think that we can offer it more, but there becomes really this technical issue that we need to work through. As we look at the new towers that are being built, again, we are interested in sharing on those. What I'll share with you is that we are using federal highway funds to build those, and that makes the concept of sharing tougher, but not impossible. What we might have to do, depending on the arrangement, is we might have to buy those towers from the federal government to share them. All right, because the federal rules are pretty strict about what you can do on assets that they've bought. All right, let's see if there's any questions. Next slide. So I'll tell you, and we'll get to it in a sec, but as we looked at, hey, can we use COVID funds to expand this network, based on the rules that we're currently associated with, we thought the answer was yes. We did submit an initial proposal into the funding request process to actually look at 12 new towers. Now there's about 17 different spots that we thought would make sense. We thought it made more sense for us to try and bite off what we could achieve in a year, and that's about 12. And so somewhere from that 17, we'd pick 12. And so that's really, as we look at expansion, that's what we think it would be. Here is, Mr. Chairman, the map that you asked us for. And this one is, as you alluded, as was discussed in previous discussions, there's a lot of information that's really hard to come by in terms of where fiber is. But to the best of our knowledge, the roads that have the pink line all have fiber on them. And then the roads that have the little dots do not. And so that's currently where we're at. And it's probably almost like you'd expect. I mean, the most of the primary roads have it. Some of the more secondary ones do not. Okay, Mr. Chairman, moving on. So you did ask us about, hey, what are we going to do in the future for COVID and WyoLink, and what have you requested? So the first bullet there's the discussion of 12 extra WyoLink towers that will fill in the gaps that we currently have. But certainly, if we plan them right, and we looked at exactly where they were going in terms of state lands, could be used in this sort of concept of expanding the broadband. The next item down was the installation of fiber optics into the WyoLink sites. I'll tell you that one was we have a map on the next slide, so I'd just really like to hold a discussion on that until the map. But this one, the $1 million is a placeholder, because the cost on this one is very difficult to estimate without doing really a tower by tower analysis of what it takes to hook up to the closest fiber. The next item down we thought was fairly important, and we did submit a funding request for this one, an extra $150,000. So in terms of things, it's fairly cheap, but that allows us to start into the process of integrating 4G and 5G into this LMR, into the radio network. And we see that as crucial as we go down the road, specifically as you start looking at some of the 5G technologies that are coming online. And that gives us a way to leverage both technologies on our current system, which is good. The other thing we've discovered is, our microwave backhaul, and that's sort of how the messages get really back into the central processing computer, are old. And so we really thought, hey, you know what, if there's some money to be spent, it would be good to update that backhaul system, and you can see what the cost there is for that. See if there's any questions. Next slide. So, Mr. Chairman, here is really the towers that we, through our very rapid calculation, thought, hey, listen, we think there's some potential for fiber connectivity in those sites. Now, this is the one that was difficult to access or to exactly decipher the cost, because as been talked about before, there could be fiber like a mile away, but you can't connect to it. The closest place you could connect to it is 100 miles downstream. So you'd actually have to lay a lot of fiber to connect to it, and there'd be a lot of analysis that we just frankly didn't have time to do before this meeting to get that exact cost. But there is the potential, Mr. Chairman, for connecting fiber to connecting fiber to those WireLink towers. Next slide. You ask us about dig once and the utilities department. In terms of dig once, we do indeed have a policy that said, hey, listen, if once we work through all the processes and utilities are putting a fiber into the right of way, we only want to disturb it once. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is safety. Two is actually those right of ways are starting to get filled up. And three is we don't really want you digging it up again 5 years from now or 10 years from now. Now, what we have done is this, is along the interstate, if you put in one conduit, we're asking you put in 2 empty ones. And that one's pretty much been done and accomplished. We did have, we are currently actually revising our policy that addresses this, and recently had an incident out in, I think it was about Pine Bluffs, where it was a 2-lane road, and the local district engineer was really using the rules according to the interstate. And as we worked through that, we said, hey, you know what? Those interstate rules probably don't make a lot of sense for some of our 2-lane, based on really, we probably aren't going to need capacity to have, 2 empty conduits there, and certainly respect the issue about cost for our utility providers, for the cable providers. And so went with the policy of, hey, listen, a cable provider, please put in the ability to expand for what's realistic in the foreseeable future, so you don't have to again. And that was a good compromise, and we're down the road there. And just go back for a sec there, please, Troy. And one other thing to point out there on the utilities department, on the bottom section of that slide, we certainly have this thing called a shared resource agreement, and the request there is, hey, we are putting this thing into the right of way for free. There is no charge. Some states charge for the right of way. We do not. And so, but as part of that, if there is electronic devices along the highway that we would like internet to use, then we ask them to put a connection in there for us, and we do that up and down the road. And so that's really key to us, and has been very helpful actually for YDOT. So those digital message signs that you see overhead on the interstate, that's an example of a shared resource, because we hook into that fiber that's along the road. Same thing for some of the other, like the variable speed limit signs that are up there. And so that's a nice deal. But right now we think we have a pretty good partnership with the cable providers. Next slide. So a lot of discussion about, hey, what does it take to throw fiber into the right of way? And the shorter answer is this, is if it's federal land or federal money involved, then NEPA processes typically exist. Now, I'll tell you, on this COVID money, we don't know for sure yet what the rules are on that. We have a meeting with Federal Highway on Wednesday to talk through that. But we received about $50 million from the FAA to expand projects with COVID money. NEPA does apply in the FAA money. So, if that's an indication of things to come, we think it will apply. Now, here is the good thing, is because we've built roads and we've disturbed roads, the federal government through federal highways allow us what's called a categorical exclusion. And what that is, hey, we know you disturbed that soil, so we're pretty sure that we've already had an environmental inspection of some sort. So we'll allow you to expedite the process, and typically it speeds it up from like 2 years down to 3 to 6 months. Can it be much faster than that? I've asked my guys that, and they're looking into it. So if it's BLM or Forest Service land, the NEPA process will always apply. But again, we've got the categorical exclusion there because, interestingly enough, part of my education process in the last year is when we put a road through federal land like that, we don't own the land. We get basically what's called a transportation easement, and still all the federal rules apply to that. Okay, any questions?
So Director Reiner?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Director Reiner, thank you. And this is, so everybody knows, some of us legislators have been having a conversation with YDOT and others about in preparation for this meeting. So when he talks about other meetings, that's what it's been. But one thing that we brought up, and I see this, and I understand you get a category, and I do understand what a categorical exclusion is. And I think what we're trying to figure out, right, is if there's a way we can, we, the state of Wyoming, through you, can plow in some conduit where it doesn't exist, perhaps in areas where there is federal land. And then, then we eventually can get a private partnership back to a private entity to really take care of that asset. Do you think there's some possibility that we could do that, that we can facilitate getting some fiber in the ground through this categorical exclusion that you may have, and then find a way to, really put that back in private hands, or at least run it privately, or what are our opportunities there? Because that's huge. I mean, we have projects being held up on the west side of the state constantly in right-of-ways, already existing right-of-ways, just because we can't get federal approval for them.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that's a good question. In fact, that's what we have the meeting Wednesday with the federal highways to discuss is really in the end, what we've got to say is, all right, gang, how do you speed up 3 months on a category exclusion? Because right now people say, hey, that's really fast. Sounds, hey, I'm the new guy here. So the question is, hey, can we make it faster? And so, Mr. Chairman, we'll pursue that as we go down the line, because what I understand, really, the intent is rapidly putting conduit in the ground through whatever we come up with. Really, I think you'd say, that's the goal. We just need to figure out how. And then in the end, if we can turn it back over to somebody, that would be great. When you go back to that, I think what would be helpful is to understand exactly, where we're looking at going, because the rules are so different. The rules will be different if it's BLM or Forest Service land than if it's not. And so I think part of the issue will be, certainly we won't do all 6,733 miles of road this year. And so then, it's like, well, where's the priority? And that may give us the opportunity to sort of dial in the requirements and exactly what we can do to speed it up. But we'll have that general discussion here on Wednesday.
And thank General, just a quick comment on that, and then I'll let you keep going. And I think a note to Barbara, and industry, that think about this idea of how we get conduit in the ground. If we can get some in this year, where would be the priorities of industry and how we could do this in a cooperative fashion? And so just note to self, Barbara, and others that are listening on that idea. So General, please continue.
You bet. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the next slide here talks about right-of-way. So, Mr. Chairman, and for the rest of the people that weren't involved, one of the questions you asked me is, can we use the transportation eminent domain to facilitate putting fiber into Wyoming towers? The quick answer from the Attorney General's office was we think so. We think you could do that. So that was good. Now, my caution to the group as we look at that is, it's always better to do it without eminent domain, because eminent domain is very slow. In fact, out in Senator Dockstader's area, we've got a project that's been held up for a year based on eminent domain. It's finally finally we'll get it to trial, I think the end of here in June. And it is a slow process. And hey, I understand it, right? It's a big deal for the government to take land. And so, but there's my answer, Mr. Chairman. Yes, it's possible, we think, but it is not quick. Next slide, please. In terms of Utah, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to turn this slide over to Mr. Babbitt because this is, we'll let him talk through this one.
So, Mr. Chairman, you had me see if I could get in touch with our Utah counterparts, and I'll just go over real quickly some of the differences that may not be on the slide here real quick. First of all, Utah has a full-time fiber optic position. This individual is, because of their legislation that was written, they're able to do more or less a barter system. So it's a mix of state-owned conduit and fiber, as well as the service providers together. That is how that legislation was written, and that's the opportunity that they have. Two other huge points. Number one, she's got 3 full-time legal staff that is working all the right-of-way, all the eminent domain, anything previous years ahead of time to get Utah moving as quickly as possible. And then the mapping, you guys have hit it hard already. She has at least 3 full-time, if not 5 additional folks that are doing all of the mapping for Utah, so that they know where they can barter and trade strands and do the rest of that. So again, I'll go back to the slides just real quickly. Most of that happened in the late 1990s when they started to do that. Of course, the Olympics was coming in early 2000s, which really pushed that forward as well. And then some of these are just some key points of the value of the interstate, the large expansive linear corridors that are pretty much free of obstructions. It should help the process. And then in exchange, who in fact pays for that conduit. That's a huge piece of it. We've got currently the process that we have in place right now, it works hand in hand with ETS, what they just described. If we have a location of a tower and we need fiber to it, we give the latitude, longitude coordinates to ETS. They throw out the bid out to all service providers for equal opportunity, and we get the bids back as who comes back and who's the most reasonable cost to be able to provide that service. I don't see that we would veer away from that process. It's working well. It gives all the service providers the opportunity to bid on it. The conduit in the corridors is the same thing. I think you'll hear from Liz Zerga following us. We just had conversations. Anytime, I think we've got a good working relationship with those service providers. They're first in the trench. It's not a typical road construction project. It's up by the fence line. And as the director mentioned, those are getting pretty full. So our staff comes forward, brings all of our resources together, works with them to create a plan as to they're going to pay for the conduit. They're going to be the lead in that. If in fact they need to lease strands with other service providers, that's totally up to them. But it's a coordinated project that the service providers that we work with as far as that. So with that, I'll stop sharing the document.
Mr. Chairman, that really concludes our prepared remarks for you, pending any questions or comments that you might have.
Well, first of all, I would really like to thank, and I'll get to Senator Landon in just a second. I really like to thank you for gathering information in a short period of time that we've asked for. You know, we're just kind of throwing mud on the wall and trying to see if anything might stick in the end. And so I really appreciate your effort there. And I think do stand by or have somebody stand by as we go forward in this meeting. We might have other questions. And Senator Landon, please go ahead.
Gosh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And Troy, this question is for you. As you visited with the Utah counterparts, that model, when they set up a lease agreement with their private companies, how does that work? Is that a return on investment that comes back and helps them to fund that legal staff, for example? Or did you get to that level of conversation with them?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, I did not get that far into those conversations. My understanding is because of the way that structure is set up with the barter system, she's free to wheel and deal, which actually whatever works for them in certain instances. If a service provider needs strands and they've got them over there, she can trade back and forth. So it really seems like it's an open door policy with her department there.
Yeah, thank you, Troy. I'm really intrigued by what they've got going on down there, it sounds like that's really expediting some things, which is of interest to many of us, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, anybody else, does anybody else have any questions of YDOT for right now? Don't see any hands coming up. So once again, Representative Lindholm, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry, I was a little late on the punch there, and I really appreciate everything Whiteout has done as far as get us this all this information in a really a timely manner. I think it's been great. I guess my question would be in regards to the WyoLink towers. We've heard from you that, I mean, essentially they're available for use. How does that work with suppliers as far as availability for use on certain towers? Is there, I mean, I see your document or your map showing all the WyoLink towers. Has that been spread out to those industry possible partners as far as saying, hey, use them if you want?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lindholm, yes, we have shared it with the majority of service providers. I think that is no secret to any of them. We're open to opportunities. We have had several of them that have already been partners that have come forth that have looked for that opportunity. Again, of the existing ones that were built, let me just go back in history just a little bit. When WyoLink was built, it started in 2005. As Jason talked about, Unified Network really didn't start to take shape until about 2013. This entire network was built on old, well, at that time it was probably high capacity microwave network. There was no real opportunity to connect fiber into these locations. As we move forward through the years, we work hand in hand with Jason and his team to try and get fiber optic to those to offload any of the traffic as fast as possible. So again, if a service provider, it really depends on the size of their dishes, their equipment, if we've got space, the security, all those things in detail. We'll work with a service provider, and if it's an opportunity, we certainly will.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions? Speaker Harshman. Speaker Harshman, not having any luck?
Yeah.
There you go.
Sorry. Thank you, Troy and Chairman. Just back on page 8 of your presentation, how many of those are circled up? It looks, is there 50 of them, rough 40, 30, 40, 50, those towers that could take fiber? You only have a couple right now with fiber, right?
Mr. Chairman, Speaker, that is correct. I think there's 55 that are circled there, and really, this is pretty much our best guess. As Representative Summers, as we've talked about the mapping piece of it, WYDOT really hasn't been doing, we didn't get into this game until approximately 2013, 14, and with the Casper to the Colorado border ACT fiber run, that was one of our first ones. So a lot of these lines may not really be to scale, but it's what we thought there is fiber there from some of the service providers. So again, a lot of analysis would have to be worked on. We do, in fact, currently there is only about 5 to answer your question. I'm sorry, it started to veer off a little bit.
So, Mr. Chairman, I mean, the next step, can you get us, how fast can you get, I mean, there's some of these that are going to be quick, probably. Some, as Colonel said, you'd have to run it 100 miles down the road. Probably not interested in those right now, but there's probably some that are pretty close. And I guess, will you be able to identify those in the coming weeks, next few weeks, and say these are probably the first tier, second tier, and so on?
Mr. Chairman, Speaker, we'll certainly work on that. As you look at communications clusters, usually our locations are next to possibly some commercial providers close by. So those would be key ones that we'd focus on. You know, most of the southwest corner was probably not lit up very high there because of the terrain. Most of those sit on high mountaintops, and it's incredibly expensive build. You know, a rough estimate in flatland is, you know, $10,000 per mile to get conduit and fiber in the ground. So it's expensive.
Sure. Okay. Well, thanks. We appreciate your work and look forward to more info.
And I'll get to Senator Landon, I believe, again in just a second. But, you know, another note to self, Barbara and others, is as you look at that map of those towers and we think about, is there a possibility that they could be used by cell or broadband providers for whatever they may need. It's not outside the realm of possibility. We could rebuild a tower if it didn't have the right structure. And then obviously fiber is a big deal because you need to be able to download basically all that data that's building up needs to get to fiber. And so it's a big deal. So note to self to providers to think about which of these might be worth getting fiber to and having agreements available. Senator Landon.
Well, just real quickly, Mr. Chairman, thank you, because I know you need to get on with your agenda, but just trying to get arms around this issue of the WildLink towers and how our suppliers might be able to take advantage of that. And it sounds like some are, and just trying to understand what sort of an investment that is up front. Is that the state's investment in that supplier's ability to service that area? Or is there some investment on the part of that supplier to help you get fiber over to that tower? Just trying to get a sense of what return does the state get on those towers, if any?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Landon.
Thank you.
So in the past, really return on investment is for the state of Wyoming. WYDOT, I don't foresee us really having a huge benefit, but of course, reaching out to those ranches wirelessly or whatever would be the possibility. There is no funds that we help support. This is a partnership with our service providers. They would provide the equipment there, all of their equipment. We'd probably work together on security issues, internal and external on the tower side of the fence. And you might have some easement right-of-way issues that we'd have to work out because all those agreements are specifically under WYDOT right now. So a lot of I's being dotted and T's being crossed that we'd work with. But it is a partnership. It's working with those service providers. It's their equipment. It's their investment. We're providing the asset, the resources that we have, which is pretty much the land.
Okay, thank you for that, Troy. Appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman, if I could add one thing to that, I think the real opportunity maybe in this space, certainly going back and retrofitting or changing the towers is an option. But we did look at funding for 12 new towers, and so if there's an area that makes sense to expand into, in terms of last tactical mile. And then my recommendation to us as a state is, hey, we look at going there specifically if it's state land, and that you design the tower to accommodate from the get-go some of these other providers. And it just strikes me as there's a real opportunity there to leverage that WildLink tower from the get-go for multiple purposes.
And Senator Landon, I think our idea, at least in discussions, was how can we leverage the assets we have and the assets we know we're going to have going forward to enhance what we have today? And would we be able to use some CARES Act dollar perhaps to do some of this? And some of the ideas, for example, cell service. So we don't have cell service everywhere that we could have. And is there a way to somehow leverage these dollars and an opportunity here to basically expand service that doesn't exist, utilizing infrastructure we have today and maybe expanding that infrastructure?
No, I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. I think that's absolutely right. And I totally get that. I just know rolling into the next couple of years what we're going to be looking at. And I think I agree with Director Reiner. I really believe there's a lot of opportunity here. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Von Flattern, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't add, you are Chairman of Senate Chair of Transportation. If you have any thoughts or any questions, I'd certainly like to hear from you before we leave.
Well, as long as the committee understands that thank you, Mr. Chairman. As long as the committee understands that it takes some engineering to do this. So the fiber company or the ISP company would have to pay for that engineering part of it. The state's not on the hook for re-engineering a tower. So I want to make sure of that. And Ms. Chairman, you did say, you know, we could possibly do a tower or redo a tower. And I just want the committee to understand that it takes re-engineering, and it also takes somebody paying for that tower to be done.
Correct. Thank you. If there are no other, Senator Dockstader, please.
Just really quick, Mr. Chairman,
Senator-
Chairman
Yes.
Von Flateren, what would the cost be roughly to that? Or maybe the general would answer that.
I think, Mr. Chairman, I think I will let them answer that.
Mr. Chairman, really our typical estimate is for $1 million for a tower. And I suspect by the time you pull one down to put another one up, it'll be close to that. And I'll see if Mr. Babbitt has a better estimate.
Mr. Chairman, I agree with the director.
All right, if there's no other questions. All right, I thank you. And if you guys, you know, somebody stick around, we're probably going to have a lunch break. It looks like it's 11:47 now. I think we got Liz. I see Liz's face up. So I think we're going to go to Liz Zerga with the Wyoming Telecommunications Association. And Liz is going to kind of give us a presentation on, from the industry perspective, on where they're at, where they've been, where they're going. And then we will take a break after that. Thank you, Liz, for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you very well. Thank you.
Very good. I'm going to try to share my screen. Thank you to LSO for assisting in that. I don't often do that. So let's see if we can get this done here. So share the screen. You should now see a PowerPoint.
Very good. We do see a PowerPoint, Liz.
Great. Hey, things are going very well here. So first of all, thank you everyone. Liz Zerga on behalf of the Wyoming Telecommunications Association. I was asked to present on the state of broadband from an industry perspective. And so I represent certain carriers in the state. And here is my, let's see, there we go. I don't represent all of the carriers in the state. I represent the Wyoming Telecom Association. So the first thing that, many of you know this, but not all of you do, who is the Wyoming Telecom Association? So there are 9 active member rural communication companies. Historically, these are the companies that provided phone service in specific certificated territories in Wyoming. They're All West Communications. They have subsidiaries. DuBois Telephone Exchange, Chugwater Telephone, Project Telephone, Range Telephone, who has multiple subsidiaries, including ACT, RT, Silver Star, and their subsidiaries, TCT, Union Telephone, and their subsidiaries. And where do they serve? So if you take a look at this map, and I'd like to spend just a little bit of time so that everyone on the task force has a sense of where we traditionally operate, and that plays into federal funding that we receive in order to provide broadband services in those rural areas. And I also want to talk to you about where we have extended our network out of our areas to reach communities that are traditionally served by the larger carrier in Wyoming, CenturyLink. So as you look at this map, the traditional territories of the rural companies are the color blocks. And so, for example, up in the Sheridan area and Sundance area, you can see that that is traditionally Range. And Range's subsidiary, ACT, has stepped out of their territories, extending fiber down into Gillette, Wright, Buffalo, Douglas, Wheatland, Cheyenne, Glenrock, Casper, over into Riverton, Arapahoe, Fort Washakie, Ethity. So you have a sense that that company has extended fiber very long distances throughout the state in order to reach those areas. By the same token, take a look over in the western part of the state. We'll take a look at the green, which is Silver Star. Silver Star has traditional territories where they operate, and then you can see that they have stepped out of their territory to go in to serve Wilson, Jackson, Teton Village, Moose, and so on and so forth. The same is true down with All West, down in the western part of the state. They have a very relatively small area, and they have stepped out. So what I wanted to point out is these carriers are traditional in certain areas. They do receive some federal funding. They're very, very high cost areas to serve, but their subsidiaries have stepped out with fiber and have brought fiber into other communities in Wyoming. Moving off of that, what is the state of broadband in the YTA service area? So when I speak of the YTA service areas, I am talking about the traditional service areas that you saw. And due to the large investments in fiber to the premises, in many of those communities, in those areas, it's world-class. These providers deliver gigabit symmetrical services to 24+ YTA served cities, towns, and communities. They do that with fiber. Their investment in their traditional territories and where they have stepped out has resulted in their service being very good. And good because what they have done is they've taken those communities where they've invested heavily in fiber, and they have basically webbed out to serve further and further into the territory with fiber and copper, and with fiber and wireless solutions. And most importantly, in those territories, the state of broadband is improving. They make investments. They have major investments. They constantly have broadband expansion projects, most of them fiber, that are ongoing and planned. The YTA carriers have expended hundreds of millions of dollars in upgrading their networks in Wyoming, and they have concrete plans to spend hundreds of millions of more within the next decade. One of the questions, and I know you have talked about this some, is what is broadband? And perhaps many of you, what the FCC considers broadband. They consider a customer to be served if they have broadband access of at least 25 megabits down per second and 3 up. The reason that's important is federal funding for deployment of broadband in rural areas hinges upon whether or not the FCC says you are served or you are not served. So it's important to know that from that perspective. This is the FCC chart about general usage and what the minimum download speeds are. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on that, but you can see that the areas where you get more intensive needs for broadband are streaming Ultra HD 4K video. And then video teleconferencing is, they say minimum is 6 megabits. Now that is a single user. So here is the FCC's table on household broadband use. And so the way they've organized this is light use, moderate use, and high use. And they have on the left column the number of users or devices on that connection at a time. So you can see for light uses of email, browsing, video, for the most part, 1 user, 2 users, it's basic. And if you go over to the right-hand side, basic service, you need 3 to 8. For medium services, once you get down for those uses for 3 or 4, they say you need 12 to 25. So when is it that you need advanced services? It's when you are doing basic functions plus more than one high demand application at the same time. And the FCC has high demand applications or streaming HD video, multi-party video conferencing like we're doing right now, online gaming, and telecommuting. Those are high use. So as long as you have one person, they say you need 3 to 8. If you have multiple users, it jumps 12 to 25. And 3 or 4 users, it's advanced, more than 25 megabits per second. That's the minimum. So, and then I think I don't need to point out to you what the current state statute says about what is unserved in Wyoming. This is the state statute for the Broadband Grant Fund. And it's 25.3 or less if you're residential or in a town of less than 2,000. And if you're in a town of 2,000 or more, it's 50 megabits down, 5 up. So I told you that YTA members invested in high-speed fiber and broadband. They were the first carriers to install fiber to the premise throughout entire communities in Wyoming at huge dollar investments. Why am I stressing fiber? I think you've heard some of the other speakers, including Jason from YDOT. Fiber, when it comes to broadband, is king. And my carriers have fiber, they have cable. In other words, they operate like cable television, some of them. They have fixed wireless, they have copper, they have mobile wireless. Fiber is what you, if you could choose, you would want fiber. You would want fiber to your premise. Why? Very high broadband speeds. To residential, typically today you can get symmetrical gigabit to most customers if you have fiber to the prem. Fiber has huge capacity compared to other mediums. It is a reliable mechanism. It is scalable. It is redundant, and it can be made redundant. And we know how important redundancy is in today's world. It is sometimes referred to as virtually future-proof. It is usually necessary for other high-speed broadband technologies, including, and this is something that not everybody understands, you have to have a lot of fiber for 5G wireless, especially 5G wireless that approaches gigabit speeds. My carriers at YTA supply fiber to cell phone companies. They are the fiber to the towers. My companies provide fiber to the fixed point wireless providers here in the state. A lot of fixed point wireless providers get the fiber from us. We take the fiber out to their facilities. We supply the fiber for coaxial cable at times. Sometimes coaxial cable companies will have their own fiber that they install, but it is absolutely necessary for the state moving forward, as Mr. Miller said, to have fiber as much as possible. So where has YTA put their fiber? Not only have they put their fiber to get between those long expanses of communities out into the CenturyLink territory, within their communities and within communities that are in CenturyLink, they have put in fiber to the premise. So look at the column on the left, my left, your left. Those communities have fiber to the premise. Those communities are gigabit capable. And you know, that represents massive investment by YTA carriers. Next, in the next column, you have fiber to the premises, community installation in process. So I told you they're building now. They were building last year, the year before, they're going to build next year and the year after that and the year after that. Look at the column where they are in the process of installing fiber to the premise in those communities. And then they have installed fiber through the business corridors in the communities underneath that column. And as you look down through there, you will see a number of the communities where they've stepped outside of their traditional territory, bigger communities, like, for example, Evanston and Gillette, Green River, Jackson, Kemmer, Rock Springs, Sheridan, picking out some of the larger communities. And then I told you that I also have carriers that are cable providers, and they upgraded their fiber and cable systems in Evanston, Green River, and Rock Springs so that they too can get gigabit services in those areas. One of the questions that I'm often asked is, well, where is YTA? Where are the carriers building out broadband pursuant to federal commitments? You know, what does our future look like? So the FCC revised its federal funding. Many of you probably know that most of rural Wyoming, in order to not only get phone service, but definitely to get broadband, you have to rely on federal funding in order to be able to deploy that broadband. It is very, very expensive. These carriers areas range from, I think it's 0.8 residents per square mile up to 1.3 residents per square mile. That's the density. So traditionally, these carriers received money in the original service territories that you saw in those colored blocks. They received money based on their investment, based on their past investment. That's how they got their federal money. And then starting in 2016, but more recently in 2018 and 2019, the FCC changed its funding program and offered a program that we call ACAM. It's Connect America funding. It's a model. They do a model that tells us how much funding that the FCC would give. And with that funding, if you elect to take it as a rural carrier, you have associated broadband build-out commitments within your traditional service territory. And so that enhanced federal funding enables access to additional people who are unserved to get them to 25.3 or above. And what the carriers in YTA have done is the vast majority have elected to take this funding. They did so mostly in 2018 and 2019. And the funding enables them to build more fiber out further. Most of them are using it for fiber deployment further out, and to reach areas where there is not 25.3. Many of those are on fiber, will be put on fiber or fiber copper, and some will have to be put on wireless because they're just far enough out that that's what you have to do. The FCC established build-out deadlines over 10 years, and the first deadline to show what you have built out to these specified locations occurs in 2022. So as we speak right now, these carriers have construction crews out building. And so there is expansion within those traditional territories to reach those areas. YTA carriers have also been awarded some federally funded broadband funds to build out with committed projects in CenturyLink service area to parts of rural Western Wyoming. Some of you are probably familiar with some of these projects. They're funded either through the USDA Reconnect program. There are a variety of other federal programs, and so they are using that money to build out into aspects of Park, Sublet, Sweetwater, Uinta, and Teton. There is a brand new federal fund that was announced. It's one that was mentioned by Mr. Kudera. It is a $20.4 billion national federal rural development opportunity fund. It's called RDOF for short. We refer to it as RDOF. What RDOF does is it provides funding for rural areas, primarily in CenturyLink service areas where there is not 25.3 to the census block. Before that, the only federal funding that was available was funding that was, with the exception of these small programs above that I'm talking about, but generally speaking, the predecessor program was to build to areas that did not have 10-1. And so there were lesser opportunities. Yes, sir.
Liz, thank you. Just a question there. So I just want to be clear on this pot of money. So if any residence in a census block has 25.3, regardless of whether it's on licensed or unlicensed frequency, then it disqualifies that census block from being covered by these dollars. Is that right? I don't know the answer. I'm asking you, but I want a clarification on that.
Sure, Mr. Chairman, I'll do my best to answer that. So the $20.4 billion fund has two reverse auctions. The first is going to occur in September. And in that first one, if the census block has service that is 25.3 reported service, remember not all WISPs, wireless internet service providers, report that to the FCC. But if they have reported 25.3 service and the FCC establishes it, that census block is knocked out for the first round of funding. Now the other important block for everyone to know, and those who have worked in this area and on policies will appreciate this, the other part that is knocked out for RDOF funding is if there has previously been an award under what we call CAF2 auctions. And for Wyoming, the significant one there, and I know, Mr. Chairman, you'll appreciate this, is the satellite providers. If the satellite provider won a CAF2 auction for funding, that area cannot receive funding in this $20.4 billion initial auction. So there is money available. I don't want to discount that. That's a lot of money. There are some areas of Wyoming that will be knocked out of funding for that, for that first auction, but there are some areas that will be eligible, and the carriers are looking carefully at that. The second round, and this gets to your question as well, and the FCC hasn't announced the auction date for that. The second round is going to break those census blocks. And so they're going to look at unserved portions within a census block, and that money will be available for that. That should open up a lot more money. The third or fourth thing that you need to know about RDOF is you are knocked out of RDOF if there is a state grant awarded in that census block. So that's something to be aware of if there's state grant funding. So I think that is what I have for my prepared remarks. There's been a lot of conversation about various aspects, and before I'm not going to get into the bills or what the bills present, but there are a couple of things that I think that are important just from a general perspective that you also know based on what questions have been asked to date and some of the comments. One of the issues or questions that has come up is what have YTA carriers done with respect to getting connectivity to hospitals and to medical clinics? And the answer is YTA carriers have put fiber to the hospitals that they serve. And so those hospitals have, access to fiber. And YTA carriers, I did a quick survey and said, how many hospitals do you have either fiber to the premise Or can you have, because as you saw, YTA has stepped outside of its territory and gone to some of these other cities. How many hospitals of the 30, I think there's 33 hospitals in Wyoming. How many of those do you either already have fiber to their premise, or can you have fiber to their premise easily because you're right in their community? And the answer was 25. And as to the other remaining hospitals that they do not have fiber in that community, I asked of the large carrier, are any of those hospitals not served by fiber? And the answer was 1. There is, according to that carrier, the answer was 1. So my understanding from all of that is that these hospitals largely already have fiber. And I know our carriers reached out to their hospitals and asked them if they are happy with their services. Are they satisfied? Do they need anything else? And the answer has been no. They are happy with their service. They are satisfied. So I think one of our issues is trying to understand exactly what problem we're trying to solve with respect to hospitals and with respect to medical clinics. Our medical clinics, to the extent they are within our traditional serving territories, especially those along the business corridors, they also have access typically to fiber. And some of those will be seeing fiber as these fiber build projects that I showed you are built out. So our perspective is that we have made huge investments to get fiber to those folks. They enjoy our services. We've helped some of them network with respect to the clinics or the outbuildings that they wanted connected to. And so we are more than happy to try to be a solution for what it is that the hospitals and the clinics want. And we do have the capability, because these carriers work together and with lots of other kinds of carriers to provide joint solutions. We can provide a joint solution provided we know what the exact desires are of that medical community. So that's one issue that I thought should be addressed.
Liz?
Yes, sir.
So could you maybe
I'm going to
not
stop share. Is that okay,
Yeah,
Mr.
yeah, and then I can see everybody. If they have questions, I can see their hands, and I don't know how to stop the share. So
Okay.
thank you. Thank you. Please go ahead. If you have anything further, if not, I'll see if there's questions.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'm trying to think, there was something else that was mentioned with respect to, I'm lost on that. So if you have questions of me, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Does anybody have any questions of Liz? Representative Lindholm, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Ms. Zerga, I appreciate your testimony. One of the concepts that's being talked about is providing community Wi-Fi, an area where people could hook up to Wi-Fi if they needed to get some schoolwork done or something like that. Do any of your carriers currently provide free bandwidth in any way, form, or what is that even a thing?
Mr. Chairman, Representative
Please.
Lindholm. So I'm glad you raised that issue. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about what the carriers did recently with respect to the COVID-19 crisis. And that is these carriers, between them, connected over 600 students who were not connected. They had network there. The network was available, but for whatever reason, the family, whether it was due to they were working off of their cell phones, they didn't have a computer or a laptop, they didn't have the money, they connected those students and they kept them connected, and most of those were for free. With respect to Wi-Fi, a number of my carriers, and I haven't done a survey to ask them whether they permanently have Wi-Fi, but I believe a number of them do. I'm aware of some that do have free Wi-Fi that they make available. Oftentimes it's near their store or their building, near their facility, that they have Wi-Fi and it's free and available. During the COVID-19 pandemic and in response to either the carriers reaching out to the schools or the schools reaching out to the carriers, a number of those carriers went out and connected and set up free Wi-Fi at schools and in other locations and opened those up for the communities. And then the last thing I wanted to say about the COVID-19 and these carriers' response is they made a pledge to keep folks connected. The COVID-19 pandemic has been financially hard on a lot of people in the community. And I asked, how many accounts are you carrying that are not paid and that you have not turned off or started any proceedings to turn off? And the answer is over 1,500 accounts that they've been carrying and without payment. And so that's kind of a long answer, Representative Lindholm. I can get that information from the carriers regarding how many of them do have free community Wi-Fi, but I know some of them do.
Thank you. And well, and Liz, thank you for all the information, and certainly in my area, I'll get to the another question just in a second. Certainly in my area, Union stepped up and they did some Wi-Fi out of some schools, and it's much appreciated. You know, just a comment, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when you say 25.3, that's up to 25.3. That doesn't mean at 5 o'clock when every kid gets on the line that everybody still gets 25 megabits per second down and 3 up. Am I correct or incorrect in that?
Mr. Chairman, you're correct that it is up to 25.3. That is usually what is stated. But I'll tell you, with my carriers, the vast majority of them are fiber intensive. And so when we say you're going to get something on a fiber system, that's typically what you get.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Hardesty, do you have a question?
Yes, Mr. Chair and Liz. So I see the map and I see the coverage areas. And is there a way that you guys have looked at quantifying, and I apologize if I missed this, the number of people that translates to being served?
Liz?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Hardesty, I can easily get the number with respect to how many are served in those traditional serving areas. That I can get and provide. Where they have stepped outside, those numbers are constantly changing because they're reaching out. So like when you go into Casper, Wyoming, and you start reaching out, that number, you know, especially during the construction season and turning on folks, it changes. And when you add up all those cities, now I can get an approximation for you, but I don't have that number right now.
Liz, I would have one other question on, particularly on, I guess, the telehealth side on those hospitals and entities. Do we have any idea what the cost is for internet in those facilities compared to what other states, you know, in other states, what would those hospital facilities be getting charged for the same level of service? Do we have any idea on that?
Mr. Chairman, I do not know the answer to that question. I have not run down what the prices charged. You know, hospitals can choose a wide variety of services from the carriers, everything from dedicated access to setting up a network to there are other solutions. I think Ms. Sessions talked about SD-WAN, which is another solution that actually I think would be a great private carrier solution for networking healthcare providers, because it puts them in charge of deciding who they want to network with, and instead of having, you know, that created by the state, they can decide which clinics they want to network with. So I don't know the answer to that, Mr. Chairman. I did remember the one thing that I forgot to tell you about. And that was, if I may, Mr. Chairman.
Please.
With respect to mapping, one of the things that I wanted to say is back in early 2019, we were looking at creating shapefile maps of coverage within our areas because we knew the FCC was going to require that of us. And we did offer at that time to give that to the broadband coordinator for mapping. At the time, they were working on other things, that mechanisms that they wanted to look at. And so as soon as we had the opportunity to reach out to Mr. Kudera shortly after he was employed, we offered it again. And he has taken that up. And so he asked for a meeting with us. I think it was about 10 days ago. He called us and said, we'll take up your offer to give provide shapefiles. And my carriers have said they're happy to do that. And they did say that back in 2019 as well.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else have any questions of Ms. Zerga? Not, thank you. Thank you for your time, and stick around. We have a public comment period next, and then we have a public comment period kind of at the end. And since you've been a presenter, you will be, able to provide public comment at either time. So with that, I think we will take, time is it now? It's basically 12:30, so 1:15. Does that sound reasonable to everybody? Shake heads. Do you want it quicker than that? Nope. Okay, so 1:15 it is. We will take a break until Speaker Hirschman.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure there's nobody out there that's signed up for public comment on any of these previous presentations.
Mr. Speaker, well, I guess we could do that. We could take public comment. If there's any public comment, I guess Brian or staff, did anybody have public comment on the topics in general, or is it just kind of all lumped together?
Mr. Chairman, it was sort of lumped together. I do know there are a number of folks who've signed up to speak. I know at least one speaker was planning on giving a general update of the companies that she represents.
Mr. Speaker, I think we'll do that public comment after lunch. Okay, so we'll be off till 1:15.